please put your cell phones on silent. I have read the abstract of our esteemed Dr. Bota's talk, and he promises to be extremely invigorating, which means that we are going to ask him and his panelists a number of thought-provoking questions, which means that we should write down our questions and be ready when it's time to ask him questions. We would prefer no statements, but a question directly to him, because that's why we have him here, and our panelists. Now, with all protocols observed, and on behalf of Professor Lincoln Bula and the management, we welcome all the diplomats, politicians, colleagues, and everybody else that has joined us. Before we start, it is always nice to acknowledge those who helped us get to this space. There's a number of colleagues that I cannot mention by name, but the entire organizing committee who's got us to this point. I really acknowledge all of their assistance, late night calls, emails, frantic WhatsApps to say this is where we are and we want this to be a success. To those colleagues, a round of applause. With that being said, I will hand over to Professor Lincoln Bula, who will do the address. Professor?
Molweni? Sanbonan? Dumelang? Lochani? Absheni? Khotong? Colleagues, I just wanted to sense through the greetings whether you were present in this important event. Let me start by thanking Professor Singh and Professor Nkosi, who are our program directors for this evening. For this morning, you'll know that I've been up since 1 o'clock this morning. Let me also recognize the Human Resources Development Institute and the University of South Africa for partnering to ensure that we create an opportunity. Sorry, I don't see and I'm struggling. To create an opportunity for the university such that we have engagements on substantial issues that affect democracy, well-being, life, the quality of life, the imaginations of futures of society. And let me at this point, colleagues, recognize members of the executive management of the University of South Africa, the Diplomatic Corps, members of extended management, the deans of colleges, extended management, members of the national and provincial local government, civil society, business community, legal, fraternal, political parties, safety and security, representatives from various institutions of higher learning and foundations, representatives of various media houses, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm truly privileged to welcome you to the inaugural seminar on state capture, which is organized by the University of South Africa and the Human Resources Development under the theme, the state capture in world politics, histories, challenges, and prospects. The inclusive aspects in this theme is quite an important invitation for us to reckon with. It is not an accident that this seminar is inaugurated here at the University of South Africa. In less than 2 months, UNISA will be turning 150 years old since it was founded. Thank you. Since it was founded as the first distance education university in the world not just in South Africa. It also spawned South Africa's universities, many of whom are seen as excellent knowledge bearers and disseminators of knowledge, Africa's knowledge systems and research. UNISA has been in the process of becoming, and it is reimagining itself. Among other things, the processes of becoming means UNISA has for a century and a half contributed to the idea of institutional building, societal building, economic transformations, and the imagination of the place of knowledge in thinking through these matters. This has not only been the best example of institutions from South Africa or from the continent, but it has also demonstrated the building of resilience and excellence, not only in South Africa, but in the continent and the rest of the world. In essence, that is the meaning of the heritage of UNISA as a public institution that we celebrate a triple jubilee in 2023. In our humble view, UNISA is one of the truly Pan-African institutions that whose researchers, academics, scholars, students must ensure that the study of institutional building and societal building are at the center. This is particularly important because the architectures and infrastructures of societal building cannot be manifest or strength if universities or knowledge institutions are not at the center of rethinking, reimagining, but resourcing the policy, research, decision systems, as well as institutional building. The governance of public institutions, goods and services is ultimately about the improvement of the quality of life of the people. A proper understanding of governance, and therefore the corruption of governance, must always take place as the point of departure, the analysis, and the purposes for public institutions and public good. And this also resonates with the idea and the existence of the state. Unlike private institutions, such as business, public institutions do not exist for profit. They exist for the public good, or what is referred to as the common good. In the absence of a growing and inclusive economy, politics and various forms of transactions combine to cannibalize the edifice of public life. Public institutions stop being centers of service and development. They become parochial instruments of primitive accumulation, even to the point that establishing competing parallel states that serve narrow private interests as opposed to the larger public good. In this way, states and public institutions lose legitimacy and become a source of strife and a state of peace, stability, prosperity, and human rights and well-being for its citizens. Program directors, I know the dominant narratives and discourses in our society today is about how we can find right leadership with moral compass or ethical compass, which is a little bit deeper than moral compass. This is an important side of struggle, contestation, and renewal. However, I want to argue that the questions and answers are not simple as they are presented in some of the narratives in the public discourse. Hence, researched, analyzed, and deepened excavation of resources that enable us to grapple with these issues are important. As a society and as an institution, as well as individuals, we need to go deeper to understand not only how state capture is established, but how it comes about. The fair allocation of resources in society is mediated by a legitimate and capable state that must always have the interest of the people at heart. A strong, capable, and ethical state does exactly that. But a weak state allows parochial interest to intervene and or mediate the allocations of societal resources and power dynamics. And often that leads to criminality, weakening and delegitimization of the state, including the formation of deep state. to understand the link between the state, ethics, politics, development, as well as their transformations across time and space, we need to return to Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth, where he speaks about the ethical foundations of national consciousness. Fanon remains as relevant as ever. He starts off by reminding us that the fight for freedom, state control, or even power is not only about the delivery of basic services. Important as that may be, rather the capture of power, state power in particular, is about the transformation of our spiritual, cultural, economic, intellectual, and material being. In this regard, scholars like Ngandawiri, Amina Mama, Michael Kaur from the Third World Institute, Adesina, agree with Fanon. For instance, Fanon starts by asserting that history teaches us clearly that the battle against colonialism does not run straight away along the lines of nationalism. For a very long time, the native devotes his or her energies to ending certain definite abuses. This may include forced labor, corporal punishment, inequality of salaries, limitations of political rights. The right for democracy against oppression will slowly leave the confusion of the neoliberal universalism to emerge, sometimes laboriously, as to claim nationhood. And this is quite a profound assertion by Fanon. But he goes further to talk about the ethical and spiritual makeup of the nascent middle class of post-independence Africa, a point that we should be attentive to, especially if we imagine the number of years that we have reclaimed our democracy. He says, the national middle class, and we should ask ourselves questions whether we are complicit to this assertion by Fanon. He says the national middle class, which takes over power at the end of the colonial regime, is often an underdeveloped middle class in the technical sense, not in the intellectual sense. It has practically no economic power, and in any case, it is in no way commensurate with the bourgeoisie of the mother country or the the center periphery theorization, which hopes to replace it. In its narcissism, the national middle class is easily convinced that it can advantageously replace the middle class of the so-called mother country. The university, as colleagues, we have to interrogate ourselves, and merchant classes, which make up the most enlightened section of the new state, are in fact characterized by the smallness of their number and their being concentrated in the capital, and the type of activities in which they are engaged, often translated to business, agriculture, and the liberal professions. In other words, colleagues, this Fanonian lens to interpret the neo-colonial states forces us to return to the base and ask the critical questions. What is our conception of liberation, emancipation, and democracy? What constitutes the capture of the state and state power and the purposes for liberation? Who are the agents and the frontrunner for the task of liberation? What kind of socio-economic and political architecture, infrastructures must emerge so that we can achieve our historical aims and address the historical but also the current injustices? By way of emphasis, the state must exist to mediate the conflict and maintain peace. It must mediate the allocation of resources to ensure that the standard of living and the quality of living of people improves daily. After all, it has been in the majestic piece of the research work by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson entitled Spirit Level as to what equality is better for everyone. The more the society is equal, the more it is peaceful, cohesive, stable, growing, inclusive, and prosperous. This is how we should locate the debate about governance or misgovernance. It should primarily be about the outcomes and the impact as well as the processes. In this sense, we will understand that corruption in the public and private sector, in a sense, undermines and is a manifestation and a product of many inputs, including the ill health of our political economy. And in this way, we will appreciate that appealing to the conscience and ethics of the people alone is not sufficient, but we must ensure that structures, systems, processes, and institutions are built in order that these transformations occur and in order that the parochial ends are ended. If we do not do this, colleagues, we will not win the battle against misgovernance or corruption in institutions, in states, or in continents, even in the global arena, for the state capture is not a phenomenon associated with South Africa. As I've said, Michael Corr reminds us that it is also what the Asian development and the Asian states had to grapple with and still grapple with, even in the current context. As I close, I wish to recall what the Reconstruction and Development Program said when South Africa was founded in 1994. Just so that we can return to the base like we did in drawing on the lessons of the classics of Africa's knowledge systems, such as Fanon and Kandawiri, Mama, and others that I've already drawn on. Wasn't it embarrassing when we read that in Mpumalanga, the driving school operators complained about the continuity of having to bribe, the continuous bribing, paying bribe of 1,700 to officials for a couple of years for people to getting their licenses, and that they were informed that the bribe was going to increase to 2,000 from November 1st. Colleagues, this is, perhaps we're laughing because laughter is the best medicine, but that tells us what our society is grappling with. We are obviously against this. So shutting, he said, the guy who reported or whistle blew on it, he says, we are obviously against this increase. So shutting the gates is the way for us to expose them. We want everybody to know that they have been doing, he said. The issue is that, in this case, the idea is not extricating ourselves from the corruption. It's just the denial of the amount or the percentage, a matter that we should be asking ourselves. The so-called encouragement fees and so on are things that we have to look into. Such an event simply conveys the message that it is not yet Uhuru. We have to work together to ensure that liberation is meaningful. It manifests in a democracy that's meaningful, where our mental, intellectual, ethical, cultural, and material aspects of being are manifest. Today we host this inaugural state capture seminar as the university that cares about the integrity and transformation of our governance systems in the state, business, labor, civil society, and other spheres of society. We do so open also to engaging around our own efforts at improving our university and understanding that the capture in the state is not only limited to states, but traverses itself into institutions, and therefore it's something that we all need to grapple with. For us as UNISA, we see this part of the practical realization of the vision that says we are the African university shaping futures in the service of humanity. We look forward to the keynote address of our esteemed guest, the renowned political activist and scholar, Dr. Tozamile Botha. I know that he's going to be introduced, but I'm truly proud to have been raised and supported. You know, all of us learn from our leaders and people who are intellectually gifted, such as Dr. Botha, and I really appreciate that he has agreed to be the first to lead the lecture. As the founding father of our democracy, Nelson Mandela once says, "It is in our hands, so let us do it." The South Africa of our dreams is within reach. The continent of Africa is within our reach. We can only be co-constructors of its success into the future. Welcome to this historic seminar. Welcome to the University of the Land, the University of Leaders. Thank you.
On that somber note, Professor Linkambula, thank you so much. Colleagues, I will not give out encouragement payments or bribes, but I would like us to do a cell phone check. Everybody, you have 30 seconds to do a cell phone check and make sure you are on silent. I would really like to give Dr. Botha the opportunity to give his talk without a cell phone going off. I counted twice during our talk, the cell phones went off. Now, I do understand that you may have an important call to take, and we respect you for that. You may leave and take your call and then enter. You may also decide to Google what Professor Linkambula has said or what Dr. Botha is going to say, and then ask him a well-rounded question, saying, this is what I would like to ask you. So colleagues, cell phones are on silent. Thank you so much. On that note, I would really like to welcome Professor Mbuya, who is going to introduce Dr. Botha. Professor?
Madam VC, Professor Linkambula, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, the invited media houses, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, may I take this opportunity to introduce Dr. Tozamile Botha. Tozi, as he is known, was born and bred in Port Elizabeth, eGqeberha. After finishing high school at Newell High School in Port Elizabeth, he registered for a BSc degree in agriculture at the University of Fort Hare in Ellis. In 1975, at this university, he fell ill and dropped out of the university. He went back in 1976 and was expelled following the students' uprisings. He went to teach matric students mathematics and science at KwaZakhele High School. He and other science students who were expelled from the University of Fort Hare formed an association for science and technology, AFSAT. And he was the first vice president of that association. Later, he became the president of the same association. Tozamile resigned and became a force of the student front at Gqeberha. And they were arrested. In the midst of the Congress of South African Students, COSAS. He was arrested and charged for incitement to public violence. The trial lasted for 3 months, and he was finally acquitted. In 1978, he joined Ford Motor Assembly Plant as a work and motion study technician on the production line. Whilst at Ford, he was elected the founding president of the Port Elizabeth Black Civic Association, PEPCO. His involvement with PEPCO led to the dismissal of himself among the 400 workers who decided to down tools, demanding his reinstatement. The workers went on strike and forced management to reinstate him. At the end of the strike, he was the only Ford employee who was arrested, detained, and upon release, placed under a 3-year banning order. In May 1980, he skipped the country to Maseru in Lesotho, where he formally joined and became an active member of the African National Congress, ANC. He registered for a BA law degree with the National University of Lesotho. He left the university in his second year of study. This followed the 1982 massacre in Maseru of 42 ANC and Basotho National. At the advice of the Lesotho government, he left for Maputo in Mozambique, and then Lusaka in Zambia, where he was elected a member of the National Executive Committee of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SACTU. He was the Deputy General Secretary to President John Nkadibeng from 1983 to 1986. In 1986, he applied for a diploma at Glasgow College of Technology. He graduated and then joined Strathclyde University in Glasgow for a Master of Philosophy in Political Science. His thesis was on British overseas development aid to the frontline states, with special reference to Mozambique and Zimbabwe. In 1981, he addressed the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid in New York. In the same year, he was invited by Congressman Andrew Young to Washington to brief members of Congress about the fourth strike in Port Elizabeth. This was part of his speaking engagements in the United States of America and Canada. After completing his master's, he went to register for a PhD degree in sociology at the University of Essex until 1990. On the release of the former President Nelson Mandela, he dropped his PhD studies and returned to South Africa as head of the ANC local and regional government and housing department. He headed the local, regional, and housing research institute at the University of the Western Cape, while forming part of the CODESA negotiation team, focusing on local and regional government issues. In 1994, he was assigned to Parliament. President Mandela appointed him to chair the 10-member Commission on Provincial Government, which was tasked to dissolve the 4 South African provinces, TPV states, and the self-governing states. Whilst chairing the commission, he was also appointed as Deputy Director of the Department of Provincial and Constitutional Affairs. In 1995, he was recruited to become the first Director General in the Eastern Cape Province until 1997, when he left to join the private sector. He is currently the chair of the Ethics Committee of the Association of Former Director Generals and Senior Associate Professor at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Tozamile Botha, sir, the podium is yours.
The Master of Ceremonies, the Vice Chancellor, senior members of the university, honorable guests, all invited members of the public. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate in this inaugural seminar on state capture. I just want to caution quickly that this is not an inauguration of state capture. In this paper, I'm addressing the complex topic of state capture in the context of the East European experiences following the collapse of the USSR during the transition from President Gorbachev to President Boris Yeltsin, with a view to draw lessons from it. Secondly, I'm analyzing the impact of collusion between the French government and the apartheid state to circumvent the UN arms embargo and the economic sanctions against apartheid during the apartheid era. The purpose of this, of course, is to look at lessons we can draw from what these colonial states did on former colonies. Lastly, I examine state capture within the South African context, looking at how the black ruling elite has colluded with the white business oligarchs to divert state resources away from the poor communities, with the hope that South Africa can draw lessons from other international experiences. But first, let me give you my understanding of what a state is. A state is constituted by 4 organs: the legislature, the executive, the judiciary, and all of this within a defined territory, hopefully a sovereign territory. One cannot talk of state organs without defining the role designated for each of these organs. Like a human body, if any one of the state organs is dysfunctional, the entire body corporate gets affected. Some organs of state are more vital for keeping the body corporate alive, just like the heart of a human body. Attacking the heart of a human body is more fatal than amputating one of the limbs, such as an arm or a leg. However, if a body loses any one of its limbs, it cannot be expected to function normally. This is the case with state capture. If the captors, for example, choose to infiltrate an institution such as Treasury or Revenue Services, SARS, the power supply, ESCOM, the state transport system like Transnet, the state security organs like the SSA, and the police services, this could have debilitating effects on the effective functioning of the state. Imagine SARS, after collecting taxes and revenue, is misdirected to serve interests other than the public interest that it is designed to do. In my view, by capturing such a vital organ of state, like SARS or Treasury, could have devastating effect and disable the entire state from performing its functions. However, not everybody agrees with the notion that if 1 or 2 organs of state are captured, that this could collapse the state. For example, former President Jacob Zuma is not convinced that capturing an organ of state could have a devastating impact on the entire body corporate of the state. Instead, he argues that state capture must entail taking control of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. Interestingly, he has a support here that is conditional. partially agrees with, now, Mulifim Charlie, for example, partially agrees with President Zuma, only to the extent that capturing organs of state do not necessarily constitute state capture, but that it is a strategy used by captor firms against large firms to shape the rules of the game to enhance their competitive advantages in transition economies. He argues that towards the end of Zuma's presidency, the Gupta family was about to shape and affect the formation of the basic rules of the game in the mining sector. In other words, the private sector, here in this case represented by the Guptas, were playing the role of circumventing the rules that govern procurement and delivery of services to serve their interest. In this regard, Chabalala draws a distinction between the BEE strategy and state capture. I mentioned BEE because in terms of the BEE, the idea was to say all historically disadvantaged people must benefit from BEE. And this was changed with the Musebenzi Zwane later to say, no. Let's not say historically disadvantaged, but let's say black people. There's a distinction because the Guptas were not here historically disadvantaged, but they fall under the category black. Therefore, they were then allowed to qualify. In this regard, Chawalala substitutes the concept of state capture with a new concept, what he refers to as a neo-patrimonialism. He argues that the phenomenon of neo-patrimonialism is embedded within the ANC and by extension, it filters through the state. I had to go back to the dictionary and I didn't find it in my Oxford dictionary, and I went to Google to look for the word. What is patrimonialism? And I found this answer. The word patrimonialism means, according to Google, a form of governance in which all power flows directly from the ruler down to the substructures. In other words, it's some form of dictatorship. Call it what you want to call, where instructions come from the top and have got to be obeyed at the bottom. For this reason, Chabalala advises President Ramaphosa's administration that to address the state capture, they should take into consideration the investigation of the BEE policy, through which, he argues, white monopoly capitals engages in state capture of a special type. Here, he refers to Moeletsi Mbeki's book, Architects of Poverty, in which Moeletsi argues that BEE globalization and parliamentary democracy constitutes the transformation formula which was hammered out during the CODESA 1 and 2 negotiations by a governing establishment comprising a black political elite and a white oligarchy. Mbeki goes further to assert that BEE was conceptualized by white oligarchs to co-opt leaders of black resistance movement by literally buying them off. As a consequence of this logic, the black political elite undertook to protect the means of production from nationalization and competition, which gave them a greater say in ANC economic policy and lucrative contracts in government. In the former East European countries, the term state capture was first introduced by Herman Kaufman et al. In 2000. These were World Bank consultants who explained the new methodology that corruption had assumed. They described their observation of the behavior of the political and business elite in the form of USSR as having been different from the way business is run normally. Firstly, Hellman et al. Described state capture as a problematic relationship between the regulator and the special interests of the regulated, as being about a problematic relationship between politics and business in the context of the transition, and it was rooted in the marketplace for influence. Secondly, they define state capture as an aberration of governance. Thirdly, they stated that some critics of capture went as far as describing state capture as being efforts of firms to shape the laws, policies, and regulations of the state to their own advantage by providing illicit private gains to public officials. At the beginning of Gorbachev's introduction of glasnost and perestroika, some members of the Communist Party and the Soviets welcomed the thinking, but not without criticism. In other words, the new thinking of a glasnost. The fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November 1989, leading East and West Germany to officially reunite within a year, effectively brought to an end the Cold War between the West and the East. Consequently, some of the USSR states, such as Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, declared their independence. They didn't wait. They couldn't wait. They were impatient. Gorbachev was criticized, among others, by Boris Yeltsin, who said he is too slow with the perestroika glasnost process. But the Americans, and in fact, the Americans were leading in that process. But the members of the Communist Party, the conservative members of the Communist Party, were very unhappy that he was taking this too far. In other words, he was selling out. So Gorbachev was caught in between. President Bush, taking advantage of the situation, came in with the CIA and made sure that he influences the KGB and some of the disillusioned members of the Communist Party to ensure that, one, they accelerate the process, and two, they create an opportunity to loot state resources within the confused state of the USSR. It was during this process that there was an attempted coup to coup Gorbachev. He was visited by 4 senior party members and KGB in his holiday place in Ukraine. His holiday place called the Dacha. And in that, they asked him to sign a form to admit that, to claim that he was sick, that he was not available to run the state, and that somebody else would be appointed to take his place. Fortunately or unfortunately, Gorbachev refused. But he had on his side Boris Yeltsin, who was the president of Russia, not of the USSR, of Russia, one of the states. And Yeltsin said, no, we can't accept this. And he called on the masses and party members to refuse and not support the coup. But remember, one of the criticisms against Gorbachev was that the Americans did not trust him completely. They liked what he started, but they didn't completely trust because they thought that his idea was liberalization and restructuring, but within the context of the USSR. In other words, he wanted to retain. That's what they thought, the USSR. And Yeltsin was not in favor of that. And the Americans had Yeltsin in their pocket. Now, once Yeltsin took over as president of the USSR, Gorbachev, of course, had no state to rule because all the Soviets had collapsed. So there were no more self-governing Soviets. And therefore, he had only to work with those that support him. So Yeltsin becomes the strongest power force because Russia was the biggest state, followed by Ukraine. Remember, Russia still had a nuclear power. Same was Ukraine. But the US quickly persuaded those few countries that had nuclear power to please decommission. And of course, they couldn't do that with Russia itself. Now, I'm going to move into a section that demonstrates the role played by the US in that confused transitional period. First of all, the CIA was able to influence some of the KGB members to mobilize against Gorbachev and to weaken Yeltsin. They would invite Yeltsin to the United States. And what do they do? According to Wells, the International Monetary Fund, in fact, first of all, during Yeltsin's period, the economy of Russia went down. The inflation rate grew to 224%. According to the International Monetary Fund, which was operating in the background to ensure that everything was guaranteed to go wrong. So the IMF was actually not supporting the state of Russia. They wanted even Russia to collapse because it still had a power. And the Americans were not interested in another superpower. So Russia should not evolve as a superpower. Americans, just like they do today, they wanted a unipolar power state, a world. By the time Yeltsin took over power, he was to have accumulated, now listen to this, enormous assets in the form of raw materials of chrome, nickel, oil, and copper, personally. And he was assisted in this by the US and the CIA, including members of the KGB. These materials, these resources were stolen from Russia to America, and in exchange, he would be given dollars for these. Now, we all know Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Harvard School. He was appointed by Bill Clinton after he came to power in 1993 to become an economic shock therapist in the Russian economy. In other words, the crisis that Yeltsin had created, you needed to move that economy to a better situation. So Jeffrey Sachs, being a well-known economist, was brought in. This shock was caused by the effects of what Engdahl called the gigantic rape of Russia's economy and its assets. Meanwhile, Russia was struggling with deep economic crisis, largely caused by the US and its allies, forcing the country into a state near collapse. One of the rampant examples of the USA looting of Russia's resources was outlined by the chairman of the Bank of Russia called Gosbank. The chairman of the bank was Viktor Gerashenko, who in November 91 gave a speech in the Russian Duma, in the Russian parliament, and said, "I have to report to you, ladies and gentlemen, that of perhaps 3,000 tons of Gosbank state-owned gold reserves, we have an estimated 400 tons that we can't account for." Now note, of 3,000 tons of gold, he says, we have an estimated 400 tons that we cannot account for. According to Williams Engdahl, that he had no knowledge of where the missing gold was a lie. Because that's what the chairman said. He says he didn't know where it went. Engdahl said the shifting of the gold was planned in 1989 in consultation with the CIA and the Bush administration in the US to remove and store the Russian gold reserves on the island of Jersey. Under Yeltsin, the Russian economy was in chaos, as I said already, that it went down to 224% inflation. The International Monetary Fund stepped in and changed the constitution to be able to control the currency flows. They justified this by claiming that they wanted to bring inflation down, meanwhile scores of factories were closing down and unemployment was skyrocketing. The collapse of the Soviet state did not only have an impact on the East European countries, it also had a direct impact on the Southern African Economic Development region. The National Party regime had successfully used its anti-communist propaganda machine to justify its military aggression on the destabilization of the Southern African states, under the pretext of discouraging its neighbors from hosting the communist ANC. They could no longer continue with this with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The apartheid state collusion with France, Switzerland, and Belgium. During the last 2 decades of apartheid rule, the apartheid state machinery was struggling to keep both the internal pressure and international sanctions at bay. Whilst it resorted to mobilizing the private sector to increase its domestic production of military equipment and the brutalization of the black civilian population, it continued to clandestinely mobilize the international community to act in its support against the sanctions campaign. According to Van Vuren and Merchant, 2017, the apartheid state had established a network in nearly 50 countries to counter international sanctions. Their allies included the incomplete secrecy, corporations, banks, governments, and intelligence agencies, which helped to move cash illegally, supplied guns, and created the apartheid arms money machine. Whistleblowers were assassinated and ordinary people suffered. This was the machinery created in defense of apartheid state against the black majority civilian population. According to Van Vuuren and Merchant, this was made possible by a network of heads of state, arms dealers, aristocrats, plutocrats, senators, bankers, spies, journalists, and members of the secret lobby groups. This international domestic syndicate was colluding to pass sanctions. It was also indirectly or directly supporting the promotion of the principle of white supremacy, committing crimes against humanity. The Swiss-Belgian banks, supported by their governments, played a major role in financing apartheid and busting the United Nations sanctions and arms embargo against apartheid. According to Catherine Prince, the Swiss banks justified their support for South Africa by stating that they were continuing business as usual. Private South African long-term investment in Switzerland increased from 27.5 million in 1988 to 3.5 billion in 1993. In 1985, banks extended loans of $515 million to South African state corporations. The Belgian bank and its subsidiaries were at the center of apartheid money laundering machine. The credit bank Luxembourg, in exchange for vast profits, helped the state-owned enterprises and the arms manufacturing company Armsco to establish a global money laundering network of secret bank accounts and shell companies to bust the UN arms embargo against the apartheid state. Van Vuuren and Merchant put the number of companies that were involved in the clandestine trade at over 800, with the banks that were putting accounts at Panama and Liberia. Whilst these transactions were illegal, they were carried out by the apartheid state for the preservation and existentiality of the white ethnic minority group or population. Apartheid foreign debt, which was inherited by the newly elected government in 1994 from the apartheid regime, amounted to 15 billion by the end of 1993. Adding the debts of the banking sector, including the Reserve Bank and the private sector, the total foreign debt amounted to 25 billion, according to Action South Africa that was campaigning against, to establish exactly what the burden of the new transition was to the new government. Switzerland also acted as a base for South African business enterprises and financial corporations, as the apartheid government opened financial consulate in Zurich in 1987. According to Ziegler, many South African companies transferred their foreign assets to Switzerland, which gave South Africa a gateway to the rest of the world, or world trade. For example, De Beers, which controlled 80% of the world's trade in uncut diamonds, put its foreign assets in a holding company in Lucerne. These state-private sector relationships were best facilitated by the 1977 National Supplies Procurement Act, which empowered the apartheid Minister of Economic Affairs, to order the manufacture of goods without due process of public tender and to order persons capable of supplying such goods to the state to do so. Referring to Frans van Vieren Merchant also confirmed that the private sector industries requested to produce items such as ranging from combat vehicles to warship and electronic equipment. By the late 1980s, AMSCO, the arms manufacturing company, had around 3,000 subcontractors, as far as Van Vieren Merchant put it. Now, this leads to a situation which still remains a mystery in South Africa today: the killing of Dr. Robert Smith and his wife. This was a very promising member of the National Party who was earmarked to potentially become a Minister of Finance. He had a constituency in Springs. He campaigned, but before he moved to Springs, he was the CEO of Santam International, him and Dr. Van Aswagen. They were given by the National Party government 30% of the shares of Santam to run the company, and of course, they were expected to do certain things that were illegal. Dr. Smith was recruited from the IMF because he was representing South Africa in the IMF in Washington. He was recruited from there to come and run Santam International. When he came back, he had heard that there were funds from South Africa that were illegally channeled to other countries in Europe, including Belgium and Switzerland. When he was campaigning and he was about to win, because he had this information which was bothering him, he whispered to some of his friends that I've got this at the back of my pocket, in my back pocket. And if I win, I'm going to expose it. And those who were unhappy, first of all, they sent a letter to him to say, just before he was killed, they sent a letter to him to say, please return the shares, your shares in Santam. And this was received by his secretary, and another letter similar to that was seen by his daughter at home. The day before he was killed, he received a message saying, can we meet you at 8 o'clock at your place tonight? And the secretary passed on the letter. The following day. And he was sitting in his office when he received the letter. And he said to the secretary, tell them I'll be there. By 6 o'clock, 6:30 that evening, 3-4 people arrived at the house. They found the wife in the house. They killed him and put him in the lounge, or entrance area. Dr. Smith, because He stayed longer at the office. He came after 8. He arrived. They didn't wait for him to look what was happening. They shot him and killed him and left him there and disappeared. Afterwards, everybody was wondering what happened, and there were a lot of speculation. Some of the colleagues at the IMF, when they were interviewed by the press in trying to find out what happened, the colleagues said, before he left the IMF, there was a rumor here that he had known of some of the staff members who were dealing with South Africa taking out some of the minerals and funds out of the country illegally. And he wanted to expose this. But he didn't have the time before he came back. So when he came back, he had found the time and investigated this. But before he died, he went to some journalists, among them Alistair Sparks, and whispered that there is this information. And we suspect that this is in connection with Switzerland. So when he was killed, all sorts of speculation went on that I'm not going to go through. Let's come back to Judge Nugent at SARS. Judge Nugent's commission pointed out that there were many governance loopholes in the way SARS was run. For example, Bain and Company, together with other consulting companies such as KPMG, whose work was used to promote a narrative that, quote unquote, senior officials had run a rogue unit justifying their removal, became one of the highest profile faces of state capture after the SARS restructuring project was blamed for destroying a previously world-class agent. Now, so people within SARS had actually created the notion of a rogue state, a rogue whatever unit within SARS, to discredit certain people so that they can be fired and replaced by others who would serve the purpose. But there was a twist to this. The Bain and Company recruited a Mr. Williams as a partner to help clean up Bain. And of course, sort out the mess at SARS. Surprisingly, Williams resigned from the firm barely 6 months after he joined it, accusing the company of seeking to take part in public relations exercise rather than having to clean up the company and show accountability. Judge Nugent had rebuked Bain and Company in December 2018 for having colluded with former Commissioner Tom Moyane, who, according to the judge, had arrived at the tax agency without integrity. When Bain and Company refused to cooperate with the Zondo Commission, Judge Nugent became critical of the firm's attitude, which he argued had left many unanswered questions about the role of its former managing partner, Vittoria Mazzoni, in the process leading up to the appointment of Dan Moyane by President Jacob Zuma. However, later Athol Williams, the former partner, who resigned from Bain, told the commission that there were numerous meetings between Mazzoni and Bain and President Jacob Zuma, where the issue of the restructuring of state institutions and the reshaping of the entire South African economy were discussed. Now, this is a meeting between Bain and Company and a director of Bain with the president. According to Business Day information had been revealed that Mazzoni was aware of the appointment of Moyane a year before it actually happened. Given that Mazzoni had numerous meetings with President Jacob Zuma before the appointment of Moyane as a SARS commissioner, it is reasonable to assume that this matter must have been discussed at one of those meetings in which the restructuring of state institutions was on the agenda. Taking into account that Mcebisi Jonas, former Deputy Minister of Finance, reported that around the same period, he was offered by the Guptas 600 million to become a Minister of Finance. So the idea was to have a chain reaction, a chain structure, SARS, Ministry, and President, to make sure that there's a value chain in the process. So it can't be a coincidence that Mazzoni knew a year earlier about the appointment of Moyane, who the judge was saying, Judge Nugent was saying already, he was appointed with no credibility. He was being appointed after the meetings and after the promise of Mcebisi with 600 million. In the same year, 2015, Jonas was offered the position of Minister of Finance. Motepu, who I don't want to call, but I almost want to call a whistleblower, who worked for for Capital, and she interacted. I'm saying I'm doubtful to say she's a whistleblower because she wrote a book about detailing her experiences and what happened in these companies. Exactly how she was used as a pawn to try and do things that she did not agree with, but at the time, nursing her job, she had to do it. She worked for Regent Capital. And these companies that she worked for had a consortium that was actually a BEE and an American company working together. And they used the relationship and the strategic link of the individuals with BEE to open doors. And therefore, BEE was actually abused to open doors for companies that wanted to swindle and divert state resources. That's why I think I agree with the gentleman who says, President Cyril, please review the way the BEE is structured at the moment, because it may not necessarily serve the purpose for which it was set. Now, before I go to my conclusion, one of the biggest problems right now with BEE is that sometimes it's used very arbitrarily. There's an ongoing story at the moment where municipalities, and I suppose maybe national and provincial, are saying in the construction of the civil construction in the townships, or in the communities generally, 30% of the value of a contract must be given to local communities. And I'm sure you've seen the headlines of how bad this has turned out to be. Because there are no clear guidelines as to exactly what that means. From my understanding, I might be wrong, you tender, you win a contract of 100 million for argument's sake, alone as a company. After being given this contract, you are now expected to look for a partner in the local community who had not tendered with you. Now, the community is going to compete for this 30%. Nobody has actually tested the capability and capacity of this BE. Now the burden is put on you who had tendered to decide or to help decide who qualifies. And that is causing a big problem. It's actually frustrating the genuine companies that want to do development in the areas. In my conclusion, in all of the examples referred to in this paper, the strategy used by the captors has a running theme. The captors target states in transition, taking advantage of the fragility of the governance institutions and job insecurity among the public servants. Because when it's in a transition, people, even when they have been there for donkey years, they are uncertain what's going to happen in this transition. Will we be kicked out? Are we going to be replaced? What's going to happen? I'm saying this because, as Professor Mzob says, I chaired this commission on provincial government, integrating and rationalizing the public services in all of the provinces. Then I had a head-on experience of being the Director General in the Eastern Cape, which was integrating two homelands and the South African state or province. I inherited 150,000 employees. I had to draw an organogram which could only accommodate 20,000 employees. Now you can imagine. We had to reduce the Transkei, if my memory serves me well, had 18 departments. Ciskei, 12. That's 40. That was reduced to 10 departments for the province. 18 departments means 18 DGs. 12 departments means 12 DGs. That's 40 DGs, deputies, chief directors, deputy directors, directors and deputy directors. All of these became nervous about their jobs. I remember the DGs at the time, nationally, that were affected. They called themselves, because I was chairing this commission, they said, Chair, you must know that we are wounded buffaloes. We are uncertain about our future, and we don't know what you're going to do with us and the people below us. And this is not enough. I'm saying 150. there were tens of thousands of ghost employees and ghost pensioners that we inherited that was taking money from the state to be paid. The captors aim to sustain the transition moment to ensure that the economic situation of the ruling elite remain precarious in order to take advantage of the inherent vulnerabilities. Because during this period, everything is chaotic. So those who can influence it, they would want to stay with the transition period, because for that period, they can enjoy the siphoning of the resources. So where there's no stability, it's an opportunity to loot. The illicit diversion of state resources to the private oligarchs and corrupt activities of the syndicates of the creation of a rented subclass which promotes instability within the public sector institutions will eventually lead to the removal of the incumbent state or government administration. And that's what creates conditions for coups in many countries. Because once there's instability at governance level, the credibility of those who are running the state goes down. And they no longer have security of tenure, even the politicians. The infiltration of the state security organs intensifies the insecurity of the state and mistrust among the security agencies. Now, for my seniors who are sitting here coming from that institution of security of the state, it's very discomforting to hear and see the corruption that is happening within state institutions, where bribery. I was looking at a video the other day. My wife shows me this video of a policeman where a case of a stolen car is reported. And the owner of the stolen car goes to this police. The policeman says, no, don't worry. I'll sort out your problem. I know the guys. And then he goes. He says, let's meet at such and such a place, and he comes back with a policeman. And the guy says, no, I found your car, and you can get it back. You only have to pay 20,000. Now, fortunately, the guy whose car was stolen was sitting at the back and quietly videoed secretly the thing. See? Now, if you can't trust reporting a case to the police, it's a big problem. Worse, in my view, if the state security agency itself gets infiltrated and becomes corrupt, then who do you trust? Because it means that the state can actually be cooled and overthrown by those whose interest are to capture the state and divert resources away. Ladies and gentlemen, I said at the beginning that this is not an inauguration of state capture. The purpose of this is to debate these issues. There are no obvious answers. You can't fire the whole state security agency. You've got to assume that among them there are very good ones. You can't fire the entire public service, because among them there are genuine, serious-minded patriots. You can't say all politicians are corrupt, because among them there are genuine citizens who have got the interests of this country at heart. But if a situation is unstable, you create uncertainties. If you are going to employ people who have no qualifications, who have no skills, you don't even really care to check their credentials. Your interest is to make sure that I employ somebody who will serve my interests, is my agent. Then you are destroying the state. Thank you very much.
Dr. Botha, thank you so much. When somebody shares any of their writing, there are two things that happen. They demonstrate their ideas, and secondly, they share their heart. Dr. Botha has shared his heart with us and demonstrated his humanity, which I'd like to thank him for. And he's now forced us to interact with his ideas, and it's time that we should start doing that. With that being said, Dr. Botha, thank you so much for your thought-provoking lecture to us. And it's not a lecture, it is something that we will interact with. Colleagues, we've been sitting for a while, so I'm going to do something a little different. I want everybody to stand up. Stand up while my co-director comes to the podium. So everybody stand up. Put your fingers up in the air. Let's move it a little bit. Yay, a little bit. Now, my co-host, Professor Mkosi, will take over, and she will lead the program from here. Thank you so much. Dr. Botha, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Singh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Kaya Sitole. Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, Dr. Botha, for your inspiring speech. So now I'm the luckiest one. I'm not going to respond to his speech. May I call upon Professor Dorothy Farisani from the College of Law, Professor Dirk Kutsie from the College of Human Sciences, Professor Tina Ace from University of Johannesburg, Dr. Penny Lekubu from the College of Law. Please take your podium. And, okay, Mr. Kaya Sitole and Prof. Dirk Kutsie, please join the platform. Dr. Botha, yes, we'll bring you back. Ladies and gentlemen, the 5 colleagues are going to respond to Dr. Botha's speech. Please jot down your questions, and we'll open a Q&A section after the 5 colleagues has presented. Tim, once I press the button, it means your 7 minutes is up. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Madam Vice Chancellor, Prof. Linkabula, all VPs present, all executive deans and deputy executive deans, all our distinguished guests and colleagues, good morning. Thank you, Dr. Botha, for such an enlightening and eloquent presentation on state capture. Professor Singh, I agree with you. Indeed, he shared his heart with us. The broader global view that you have provided puts this complex phenomenon, state capture, into perspective, and it exposes the ugly truth and the real history which our children should be learning about at school. One thing that comes out clearly is that state capture is definitely not in the best interest of society, and that it goes against the rule of law and against justice. Madonsela Sanet in 2016 states that In South Africa, state capture is something that came into being post-1994. This is clearly a misconception. As Dr. Botha has shown, this unacceptable phenomenon of state capture has been part of our existence for a very long time, and it appears to have been silently accepted as the norm by those who were aware, while the rest were simply oblivious to what was really going on. It has gone unidentified and unchallenged. Yes, Dr. Botha, things have been done differently from the way things are done normally. And indeed, this is an aberration of governance, and it has been taking place unabated. When it comes to issues such as state capture, before one can talk about justice, there is a need to identify the existence of state capture and to acknowledge that state capture is an unjust act towards the people who are ultimately victims. It is indeed, Dr. Botha, as you said, against the public interest. And yes, unfortunately, it is people at ground level who suffer the most as they depend on the state for their livelihood. Dr. Botha, you have generously provided various examples of how resources meant for societies or citizens of countries have been looted by people who only care about their own enrichment and who will go to great lengths to achieve that, whilst knowing very well that it is at the expense of communities, societies, nations. As you have correctly indicated, issues of corporate governance also lead to corporate capture within a state. Such corporate capture may occur within a state that may or may not be captured. This is our reality, and indeed it is a serious concern. It is an injustice against the shareholders and the employees of the captured corporations and all parties who have been honestly dealing with the corporation. Our South African state-owned entities, which you have referred to, remain vulnerable. And this is due to the governance loopholes that you referred to, Dr. Botha. They require urgent attention. For the most part, they are either in high care or in the intensive care unit, and it remains to be seen as to whether they will be resuscitated or not. Either way, the resuscitation process is very costly, and it is taxpayers who foot the entire bill. When such capture occurs, our community bears the brunt of it, and usually it is only when the corporation or state-owned entity is starting to fall apart, when services are no longer being provided and people lose their jobs, that reality hits home, as investigations that follow expose or reveal the gradual capture that has been taking place over a number of years, and that ultimately has the potential to lead to the demise of the corporation. Such situations may be avoided if corporate governance is practiced, if those loopholes are attended to. If they are detected and exposed early and then eradicated, this can lead to justice. However, for that to materialize, it entails accountability in the form of criminal liability. Criminal liability should not be shied away from, as the failure to hold people accountable may result in the culprits simply following a different modus operandi and ultimately achieving that capture. I'm now rushing because I've been made aware that my time is up, but just a few things that I would like to mention. When corporations have committed state capture, when they are supposed to be prosecuted, they are literally able to get away with it in South Africa. Just as an example, if the prosecution is initiated via Section 332 of the Criminal Procedure Act, which provides for the criminal liability of corporation, unfortunately, the worst sanction or punishment that a court can impose is a fine on the corporation. And what is a fine to a corporation? It is simply a slap in the face for the victims of that crime. So can that be regarded as justice? And this is all because of the illicit diversion of state resources that Dr. Botha has referred to. State capture is a serious social injustice, and when one looks at state capture from the narrower sense of a country, it is clear that without active participation of all organs of state, which have been mentioned by Dr. Botha, then we have a problem. I concur with your view that these organs depend on each other, that is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary. When all these organs perform their duties ethically and without fear, then we can have a way forward. Prof. Lenkabula, indeed, it is not yet Uhuru. There's still a lot that we need to do as members of society, as academics, and as leaders. Let us act ethically at all times, even when no one is watching us. And we need to instill that in our students as they are our future leaders. Let us not be afraid to expose wrongdoing, even when we are aware of the chilling experiences of Dr. Smith and his wife, of, more recently, Babita Diakoran, and so many more. Thank you, Dr. Botha, for the many examples you have given. I'm convinced that we came in here with less knowledge than we will be living with. You have given us a broader understanding of state capture, and we really appreciate that. And the question which you've left us with is, who do you trust? I thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Vice Chancellor, colleagues, and with that I include everyone, whether I know you or not. I think this is sort of the university way of doing it. My approach is to look at the international dimension of this. And therefore, what I want to do, and we have only 7 minutes each of us, so it's merely raising points, is to see, because it goes into, or the intention is that it must develop into a project, a research project, of what are the main points of a wider framework that we can identify about state capture. State capture is a very difficult concept. And if we look at the main milestones of state capture that we have seen in South Africa lately, it is, first of all, the Tutu Madonsela report, The State of Capture, in 2017, the Zondo Commission report. Before that, some publications by the Electoral Institute, by the South African Council of Churches, by a report which is called The Shadow State by some academics. And in none of them is it really possible to define what is state capture. What is the common characteristics of state capture across the globe? Because state capture is not a South African phenomenon. It's not something unique to South Africa. And the notion of state capture, as has been indicated, is something which emerged lately, although it is an older phenomenon, but the notion of state capture emerged very much since 2000. And it was used specifically in relation to Central Asian republics, states that emerged out of the old Soviet Union. Countries like Bulgaria, like in 2013, 2014, Romania in 2017, in Latin American countries like Colombia, Mexico, Argentina, Bolivia, and then also the Serbian Republic in the Balkan. I use these as examples just to indicate to you how widespread this phenomenon is. And most of these examples that I've used is from the Northern Hemisphere. It doesn't come from Africa. Some of them are from Latin America, but not from Southeast Asia, for example. So I will come back to that in a moment. So when is state capture possible? What are the conditions that I can or try to identify that when state capture is a possibility, that there is a high risk for state capture. And some of the presentations that we've listened to now already refers to that. The first one is that a condition of economic transition. When there's an economic transition in any country, whether it is a highly developed country or a developing country, there is the possibility of state capture. Because very often there's a process of privatization of state assets. Take, for example, the Yeltsin example that was discussed by Dr. Botha. Or of economic unbundling of state assets. You know? Or that there is new decision makers. You know, South Africa was a good example. In the early 1990s, after 1994, the Guptas came to South Africa. You know, at a time when the transition was right in its midst, and they already identified the people that they wanted to concentrate on. At a time when the new decision makers, the new members of government were still not experienced, still finding their feet, and there were lots of gaps. There was a transition taking place. And that was an ideal situation to identify persons and institutions that they could target ultimately for what we called later on state capture. Also, another form of transition is a transition of the political culture, a transition towards democratization, for example, when there's a democratization process, what Dr. Botha referred to as that instability that exists from one system, one political system, to another political system. When there's also the change in the ideological hegemony that exists. And I want to use the example of what we've seen 4 years, 5 years ago in the US, when President Trump came to power there. And one of the things that happened was this radical change that happened in their Supreme Court. I would argue that that was a form of state capturing by the Republican political philosophy that came in as a result of those changes. So that is the transition, the idea of transition is therefore a key element in state capturing in many parts of the world. But there's also another forms of state capture, and that is when it becomes a political agenda to capture state institutions as a way of weakening the political opposition. So it's not so much an economic objective, it is more of a political objective. And it can be in any society. It doesn't have to be just in transitional societies. Something very controversial, he took me up on this. I wrote an article that says that President Mbeki was involved or accused that he was using the National Prosecuting Authority in the Nicholson judgment in 2008. It was set aside by the Supreme Court of Appeal, but that was at that stage regarded as an example of that. Then President Zuma's way in which he used the criminal justice system and the persons in it, in the intelligence, in the National Prosecuting Authority, the Hawks, plus then on the other side also that of SARS, of how those institutions were used in order for internal, even inter-party, factional type of politics. Now, state capture, I would say, impacts on the relationship between the state and the economy. I'm going to leave it as one point. I've only 1 minute left now. But there's a whole discussion about the relationship, for example, between the private sector and the state. Then state capture also impacts on state institutions and the capacity of the state. That's another major discussion point, which I don't have now time for it. But that is very often used, that state capture has this counter consequence, and that is that the capturing of the state is actually undermining the state ultimately. So it's almost a suicidal project, a suicidal approach of the goose that lays the golden eggs. You actually kill yourself in the end. And when there's a public response from the public against state institutions that cannot perform anymore because of their capacity that has been eroded, because there's budgets that's not there anymore, That public rebellion, and we see that to a large extent now in South Africa, that actually made continuous state capturing or the sustainability of state capturing very difficult. My last point, and that is something which I think is part of a research agenda for this whole discussion that we have. When we talk about state capturing, then we must understand what do we mean by the state. And there's not just one meaning for the state. I have a list here of at least 5, and I'm going just to mention them. The state as part of the superstructure, sort of in a Marxist sense. The state as a terrain of ideological hegemony. Who is in control of the ideas within the state? The sort of the Gramscian notion of the state. The state in terms of institutions, new institutionalism. The state as a way of functioning in terms of its institutions. The deep state, the state in terms from a security point of view. A country like, for example, Turkey, under the current President Erdogan, has gone into that, where there's a deeper, more inner core of the state, which is being captured by some. Then the developmental state, which is very much sort of in vogue in South Africa. But the developmental state is a problematic concept because the successful developmental states were all one-party states, not democratic states. So state capturing ultimately is in a sense counterintuitive. It does not depend on the ideology, whether it's neoliberal or Marxist or whatever, there can be state capturing in it. It also doesn't depend on the level of development. It can be in highly developed countries or it can be in very low developed countries. It requires, therefore, from my conclusion, a lot of intense research that we still have to do. Our understanding of the state capturing is still in its very early stages, and therefore I welcome the idea that UNISA is going to set the table for this type of research. Thank you very much.
Good morning to everyone. Good morning especially to the Vice-Chancellor and to our keynote speaker, Dr. Botha. My name is Kasi Tole, and I've been asked to speak from the prism of the whole media landscape. And I'd like to tell you that Dr. Botha forgot to tell you one important role that the media played in the fall of the Berlin Wall. It was accidental, I must tell you. So there's a guy called Gunther Schabowski who actually died in November 2015. So he was an information official who was supposed to update the media on what the visa regulations were going to be to enable mobility across the 2 East German cities. And unfortunately, by the time he finished talking, there were so many papers in front of him. The one question that he had not been anticipated was a question of, okay, you've said all of this is going to happen, when is it going to happen? And he looked around and he couldn't find an answer, and he simply said immediately. So the Berlin Wall was not supposed to collapse on the 9th of November 1989. It was supposed to happen a bit later, but because he couldn't find the document in front of him and the media ambushed him, he then made it an immediate solution. So that is how the media actually facilitated the fall of the Berlin Wall, by ambushing someone. A very important conversation relating to the question of what state capture is. And in South Africa, inevitably, it was always going to be a rather contested space. What is very clear to me is that ever since we started deliberating on these issues quite substantively and quite explicitly, and I make that distinction quite clear in that until November 2016, the 4th of November 2016, when the Public Protector report was released, a lot of people had engaged in different forms on the fate of the nation. Who is responsible for what? Who gets to dictate what happens to the nation? So the discourse had been happening in different arenas of research and academia. But until we got to November 2016, when suddenly there was a document that said to us, this thing happens, however, the way it has been done in this particular country has had these particular manifestations. So it then suddenly became a much wider public narrative where people are then trying to understand, well, what exactly does it all mean? But at no point in time can anyone legitimately argue that it started on the 4th of November 2016 or any point in time during the Zuma administration. What is quite interesting about it all is that at the end of the day, what we've come to gravitate towards when we're looking for an explanation is that we're simply talking about the state resources, how they are directed towards particular purposes, right? So if one looks at what the state ought to do and how the state ought to act in the best interest of all its citizens, and then it turns out that there are voices within the citizenry whose influence, if I may put it like that, is a bit greater than mine, whose ability to dictate what happens to state resources is a bit different to yours, then we start seeing the problem. Because of course, it may well turn out that those voices who are amplified in the question of directing public resources are the very benevolent voices who act in the best interest of everyone else, and we're all going to get the most optimal outcomes. However, as it turns out, as political evolutions happen and as the administrations change, you're not always guaranteed to have the people in the best interest of society in control of particular state resources. So it's always important for us to simply try and figure out what the key question is. The key question here ought to be that when state resources are made available and when people then use their outsized influence to redirect them towards private pockets, for example, what are the consequences of that? The media has played a remarkably important role in how states are understood. And when I say how states are understood, remember there's always going to be the general population whose interaction with what the state does and how the state does things is not as strong or as linear as you'd like it to be. So it's in a country where people's only interaction with how much money is in the budget, for example, is if somebody writes a media report about it. They do not engage in the process, or maybe they don't have the resources or the capacity to engage in the process. So the media plays a very important conduit role in really facilitating that interaction between citizens and the ones that run the statecraft. The media also can play a remarkably dangerous role in formulating and really directing how the state and the citizens interact with each other. So if you're talking about the media in its role as the ones that enable us to discover that in the National Lotteries Commission, for example, money is being redirected from building schools into building mansions in Bryanston, that's a very constructive role. It enables citizens to then start pushing back and asking for some sense of accountability, because now suddenly it's like, wait, why is that happening? So that's a constructive role of the media. However, the media can also play a very, very gray area role, if you can put it like that. And the gray area role I can think of, for example, is a few weeks ago. The cabinet, in all its considered deliberations, decided that they wanted to make sure that ministers do not pay for water and electricity. So people formed that conclusion, and that's what happened. And then the media decided that, no, actually, we want to ask questions about this. So the media asked questions, and all of us in the media, I myself was one of it, was very, very angry about it. Mainly because I think water and electricity is expensive, and I'm primarily jealous about people who earn more money than I do and then who don't pay for it, okay? That's the one part. And then once we ran with the story and it suddenly became this public outcry where the media said, look at what these people are doing and look at how these people are advantaging themselves at your expense. You then saw the reaction of the state, where the president then said, oops, okay, actually, I'm withdrawing that particular directive. My worry about the withdrawal of that particular directive is that it is probably a result of somebody in the presidency on a Monday morning saying, President, look at all the media reports, you've done something wrong, which is fine. And if you decide to take that into account and say, I'm changing my mind, that's acceptable. The question that one has to ask is to say, wait, hold on, those pieces of media stories that you saw, were they representative of a public view or the public perception? Okay? In this one case, it probably did. However, it's not always the case. Because if you look, for example, at the problems that the United States is facing, the United States has got this huge problem where the media outlets and the media conduits have become so partisan in nature. It is difficult to know whether if somebody says that this is what I heard from the media, whether that represents the public view or the public opinion. So in the Trump years, you saw the great polarization of American media where Fox News had taken a particular stance. Fox was not representing a public view. They were representing the Murdoch view. The problem was that the other media agencies then decided that they had a problem. Not only did they have an editorial problem, but they also had a commercial problem. Because for as long as Fox News is making money from disinformation, the one way to actually get the audience back to you is to start countering Fox rather than reporting on the news. So some of you may remember the day Donald Trump lost the election, there was a very unfortunate episode on CNN where some of the journalists that were reporting on the election started crying and expressed how relieved they were that Trump had lost the election. And I suddenly sat there and I was like, wait, hold on. This is you trying to be anti-Fox rather than you trying to tell me what really happened in the election. So that was a very, very extreme response to say, actually, we as a media need to counter that other story rather than deal with the facts, as it were. So the media struggles sometimes to figure out what its role is in actually facilitating the interaction between the citizens and the state. And of course, in a situation like the ministers deciding that they don't want to have water, I think we all agree that the right decision was eventually reached. My question is, what happens on Monday when the 10 media articles that sit on Cyril Ramaphosa's desk are the 10 media articles formulated by those rogue agents who call themselves media houses but make up stories as they go along or get paid to write stories that say a particular thing? If the president is going to go and persist with the view that if the media says so, that it must be reflective of the public opinion, we've got bigger problems, don't we?
Good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to respond to my former student, Dr. Tazamila Botha's presentation. We've had long discussions over several years about his work, and it's now in a different kind of context that I get this opportunity to engage with what he's talking about. Thank you for an excellent presentation. As you could hear from that discussion that he gave, corruption is not a new phenomenon in South Africa. It was abundant throughout the apartheid regime, and allegations of corruption were also rife in the new South Africa, long before the start of the Zuma presidency. What I'm going to focus on is how did we come to start knowing about corruption, and particularly state capture in South Africa. And there I want to talk about the role of whistleblowers in this process. Whistleblowers, assisted by the media and civil society organizations, played a prominent role in exposing corruption in state organs in South Africa. As the allegations of whistleblowers emerged, it became evident that rather than mere corruption, the actions involved entailed what we now refer to as state capture. In contrast to corruption, where individuals opportunistically abuse their positions of power for personal gain, state capture refers to repeated and well-organized collusion practices where state officials extract personal benefits by giving control of state resources to agents external to the state. In 2016, the then public protector Thuli Madonsela published the State of Capture report that has already been referred to. This report collated testimonies from several whistleblowers, such as Musilo Mutepu and Bianca Goodson from Trillion. This set the ball rolling for the appointment of the Zondo Commission of Inquiry into state capture. Just about 6 months later, Amabungani and the Daily Maverick published the so-called Gupta Leaks exposures, which was arguably the single most important event in bringing state capture in the public domain. The media outlets received hard drives belonging to Sahara, a Gupta company, from 2 whistleblowers. The hard drives contained 300,000 emails showing that the Gupta family played a central role in manipulating the awarding of government contracts. In fear for their lives, Stan and John, as they were called, were relocated abroad, and they remain anonymous to this day. The Gupta leaks opened Pandora's box, and exposures by numerous other whistleblowers followed. Simpiwe Maisela at the PIC, Cynthia Stimple at SIA, Alto Sadi at EcoBank, Suzanne Daniels at Eskom, Destina Dairy Farm whistleblowers, Angelo Agrisi at Bosasa, and many more. Unfortunately, the whistleblowers that exposed state capture paid a heavy price for their acts of courage. typically they suffered various forms of, and are still suffering, various forms of retaliation. Work-related retaliation that ranges from subtle indications of displeasure to drastic victimization, such as stonewalling, personal harassment, immediate dismissal or abrupt downgrading of performance evaluations if they had not resigned before they blew the whistle, constructive dismissals, character assassinations by discrediting their motives, and we've seen a lot of that, disciplinary proceedings, termination or suspension, and backlisting. They also suffer social retaliation, and this entails practices aimed at marginalizing whistleblowers, both within and outside the organization. Colleagues and superiors become progressively less friendly. They close ranks. They identify the whistleblower as a troublemaker. The whistleblower is excluded from meetings. Co-workers they once considered friends now avoid them. All the state capture whistleblowers experienced retaliation of some kind. Some even paid the ultimate price by losing their lives, and we've already heard Babita Diokaran is one example of that, and also several of the Estina dairy farm whistleblowers also lost their lives as a result of blowing the whistle. Interviews with state capture whistleblowers showed that they shared a fundamental belief in doing the right thing, despite the likelihood of facing severe retaliation. The obstacles faced by the whistleblowers were abundant, with the South African Protected Disclosures Act providing insufficient protection, unfortunately. In the absence of sufficient whistleblower protection on a legislative level, civil society organizations stepped up to deliver the whistleblowers' narratives to the public domain and provided various forms of support. NGOs provided support, and media outlets also gave whistleblowers the opportunity of bringing their message to the public. Without the whistleblowers, the perpetrators of state capture would probably still be engaging in their nefarious activities with impunity. And Judge Zondo also acknowledged the important role of whistleblowers in providing evidence at the Zondo Commission. Now, in order to ensure that whistleblowers that we are made aware of what is happening, that the elements of state capture, one of the ways of addressing state capture is to make sure that people are in a position to disclose the information, that those people who work in organizations, who come across wrongdoing, who observe wrongdoing, that they are put in a position to be able to disclose or to raise their concerns to someone who can do something about it. And in order to do that, it's important that various ways of providing support and assistance to whistleblowers should be considered before they blow the whistle, during the whole whistleblower process, and especially post-disclosure, because that is when they suffer the retaliation that's suffered. And one of the things that I would like to suggest is that a whistleblowing complaints authority as a Chapter 9 institution should be implemented so that whistleblowers can have an organization that looks at the situation, that they can approach, and that could organize various ways of support, compensation, for example, coaching, counseling, and so on, to make sure that the whistleblowers' lives are not completely destroyed by acting with courage. Thank you.
Madam Vice-Chancellor, Senior Management of the University, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Indeed, without wanting to regurgitate what has been said by my colleagues,
part of the most important things that we must look at, which we cannot ignore. In creating what we refer as a criminal network that captured the state. In his address, in his inauguration, and not the inauguration of today's state capture seminar, Dr. Botha, the former president placed an array of his supporters in key positions, from cabinet to state-owned enterprises to the police, including the SABC. Now, these errands or adherents were usually individuals that are close or have a close relationship with the former president. And in doing so, any one individual that was going against the president was going to be removed. Now, nicely put by Borat and others in their research that was dated in 2017, Betrayal of the Promise. The former president created what we refer to as a kitchen cabinet, wherein he took control of the NPA, intelligence services, it was deliberated earlier. And like I was saying, anyone that would stand in his way was going to be removed and replaced with the loyalists of the president. Now, this sort of corruption is said to be tantamount to a coup d'etat, what we can then refer to a sudden unlawful seizure of power from a government. Indeed, Dr. Botha, it's an aberration in governance. Now, let me quickly touch on issues that are related to what we refer to as institutional capture. A very fancy name, but yet a simple concept. In large organizations, there is a tendency of employees to become focused on their own personal agendas and forget about the objectives of organizations. The other big factor is the individual's ability to want to rationalize. And in most cases of institutional capture, employees certainly know what they are doing is wrong. But they argue or want to reason that the institution owes me, or nobody will miss it, or the need of the organization outweighs the company's greed. Some may even create what I refer to as an institutional cabinet and appoint what we can term as weak leaders that may, in one or two instances or whatever, not be able to challenge you because of fear or favor, and ensuring that the decisions that you are taking, no one is going to take you up on that. In fact, I want to submit that it is more a rhetorical of what we refer to as transformation. These are just but few examples of what people would want to rationalize. But let me quickly, Madam Vice-Chancellor, to take a closer look at a very pragmatic example. Colleagues, you will remember sometimes in October 2021, there was a damning report of the Ministerial Task Team, what we refer to as the MTT report, which was unofficially circulated amongst many of us in WhatsApp groups and in medias, right? Which then alleges that the Council of the University was severely criticized for a lack of good governance, failure to safeguard the academic future. The report further, critically, throughout, engages on the flaunting of financial regulations. And according to the report, there is a pervasive culture of corruption impunity, conflict, fear, and intimidation in the institution. The report further documents a deliberate and systemic plan over a period of time to establish a corrupt network, and which I refer again as an institutional kitchen cabinet. I will not, I think what we will do is, because the 7 minutes is up, there's so many things that we would want to engage on. I will pause here. Thank you so much, Madam Post, and I will pause. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. May we give them a round of applause, okay? So, colleagues, it's now Q&A section. I will start with this section and this end, the last one. Your name, where you come from, your question, not a comprehension, and who needs to respond to your answer. Okay, may I start from this side? 1, 2, 3, go on. This side. Okay, I've got a gentleman, Dr. Moloi, second one, and then the third one. In that order, please.
Thank you very much, colleagues. I am Lehasa Moloi from Development Studies. I'm glad that I see Professor Kotze, who was my first year lecturer, who introduced me to the origins of the theories of the state. I have a challenge in this presentation for academic consumption. Should not the locus of enunciation be the problematization of the very notion of the modern state concept as a violent structure in Africa born of colonial thuggery, by extension also its neo-colonial phase as occupied by political elites? That is itself ontologically the captor of power and fermenter of corruption. And in a way, to debunk this Eurocentric colonization of terms that normalizes the very idea of the state itself. And to extend to the second question, thus, I feel persuaded to argue as a student of social sciences that there is no such a thing historically as an uncaptured state. Rather, it's a question of who captured it to serve which interest. Since the state itself is a captor of power run by a few to manage the masses, should it not be normal or normality for the state to be captured in the light of the history of modernity? Thank you.
Dr. Moloi, who needs to respond to your question?
I can take it to
Dr.
keynote, Dr. Botha.
Okay,
Thank you.
thanks. The second colleague behind? Yeah.
Okay, mine I think is more of a comment. Anyone can take it and address it. Something so big starts somewhere. And for me, it's two comments that I see. The first one is, in South Africa, policies, laws, constitution, all of those things I think are right and even perfect. Under normal circumstances, this thing could not have happened. And there was an abnormality. And what I see is, for the state to be captured, they talk about the 9 wasted years. The first 5 years was the destroyal of the capacity of the state to prevent this from happening. And for that destruction to happen, you need people who are willing to allow it or who are willing not to stop it. And where I see it is, someone said, or some group of people said, well, South Africa is a 5 trillion rand economy, 2 trillion budget. How do I access it? I need people who don't understand these numbers. And one of the things that happened is, if I can get someone with a standard 3 to be in charge of all of this thing, because at standard 3, I didn't understand, and I don't think anyone in this room at standard 3 understood the difference between 5 trillion, 2 trillion, billion, million, 100 rand. And once you don't understand those numbers, you don't understand the impact of giving someone $1 billion for doing nothing. You don't understand what that billion could have done to change the lives of people. I think that's what happened.
Okay.
The other lesson
May I
is for us
disturb
in
you?
this
May I
room.
just disturb you for a
Yeah.
minute? May you kindly stand so that the cameras captures your image for the
Okay.
TV?
Oh, all right. So, my view is that, I don't know if I should repeat what I said.
No, don't
but
repeat, just
yeah, that's my
continue,
view.
Drepa.
The lesson for all of us here, as managers, leaders of 5th, 6th biggest university in the world, is how do we take these lessons into our own environments, to make sure that we become effective and we avoid a mini capture in our own environments, is we need to be careful also, I think, about this risk of management cloning. We love, as managers, to hire and be around with people who think like us, look like us, walk like us, do things. Sometimes it's very important to hire, get people around you who think different, who can oppose your thoughts, just to make you a bit more careful when you make decisions, so that there's always noises in your ears that say, no, 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 no matter how comfortable you are with a decision. I think that would be a start. I mean, at macro level, big level, the panel is smart enough to comment on that, but I think in our own small worlds, that's the first step that we must make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then it was the guy behind, yes, yeah.
Mamed away from the Department of Jurisprudence. The problem that I have with the submissions that have been made is that whilst obviously they are rich in terms of the facts and what has actually transpired with regard to the machinations of the state capture here and, of course, in Eastern Europe, it doesn't really enlighten us much, right, in terms of what really does it actually mean? And I'll say, what do I mean by that? What do I mean is this, that it does not explain that the state per se never and can never stand outside of society. And by that I mean that at any given point in time, a state is always an organization of particular, and I dare to argue, a dominant economic and corporate interest in a class society. And therefore, when we say capture, what do we really mean? The state in this country arose, firstly, you could say, as the state of the four-tracker farmers, and was always a state as an organization of a suppression, but also a colonial dispossession and conquest. It became, it was reinvented with the British colonialism. And today, what is a state? When we say it is free, because to say that it is captured, you mean that if it is not captured, it is, so to speak, an organization of every one of us. And that's not true. It's true of capture under Ramaphosa, as it was under Zuma, and as it will always be under capitalism. To mean that, particularly in South Africa, is always going to be an organization of corporate interest in the mining and other key sectors of the economy, and never, and always, if anything, a hostile class organization for the suppression and subjugation of the working class and the poor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, may I allow the last pillar, and then I will allow Dr. Potter to respond. The colleagues, this is your turn now. Okay. Prof. Peñera, the guy behind, yeah. And then, yes, I noted you, sir. Yeah. Please stand up, Prof.
My name is Evaristo. I teach politics. Dr. Botha, how do we reimagine, how do we rethink, and how do we reformulate the state so that it can become capture-proof can we have a state that is not capturable while least we are within a predominantly capitalist world system?
Thank you. There is, yeah, I've got, yeah.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, my name is Sabran Strubich. I'm from the Auditor General of South Africa. So firstly, I just want to thank and take this opportunity to thank the keynote speaker, Dr. Botha, for his thought-provoking thoughts and challenges posed to all of us. So my question is for Prof. Farazani. Sorry for the pronunciation. So dear Professor, your contribution, as I understand it, is that our legal environment was weakened to such an extent that consequences are either just a slap on the wrist or non-existent. So the question is, what then? At the Auditor General of South Africa, we embarked on a new aspiration where we say we want to really influence the culture in the public sector to shift from doing harm to doing good. So I was really interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Botha would love to come in front and respond, followed by Prof. Farisani and anyone who'd like to take. We'll do the second round, colleagues. Please be ready with your questions.
I'd like to make a disclosure that I'm not an expert in all of the questions raised. I'm sure there are more people who are better positioned to answer some of the questions, maybe even among the panelists here. However, let me try. I don't think I had all of the questions properly, especially the last question from the Auditor General's. Okay, good. Reconceptualization of the state. I think the point that was made earlier is that the state itself is a capturer of power. Am I correct in that? Naturally, the state has to have power to run society. So that we can't avoid. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, a state represents a particular thinking. Call it an ideology. Whether it's a capitalist or a socialist conception of that idea. Now, Gramsci says that the state is represents a hegemonic view of society, and therefore it represents a particular interest. So you could argue that in a capitalist society, the state represents the interest of business. In a socialist society, the economy is controlled by the state and therefore it's managed. It's planned by the state, is managed by the state. Now, who is the dominant class? Or what is the dominant ideology in that? Is the ideology of the Communist Party that runs that state. Because a socialist society is run largely by a political party that represents a particular ideological interest. In South Africa, we talk of a neo-capitalist or neo-capitalism I'm not sure what that means. I use it, but I don't actually know the actual definition. It's like Chabalala on this question of neo-patrimonialism. He smartly replaces, he doesn't call President Zuma a dictator or a feudal lord that runs the state like a feudal lord, forcing things down the drain. He says the power comes from the top and filtrate down to the lower echelons. Now, one of the discussants made the point about institutional kitchen cabinet. Now, if you take an institution, isolate it from society, and take the employees that serve that institution, ideally, they are supposed to be working there serving the interests of society. But if they constitute themselves into a cabinet that no longer represents the interest, does it necessarily do away with the institution? Or when they speak on behalf of the institution? So the reality is that if we say a security organ of state is corrupt, is hijacked, it no longer serves the interest of the majority of the people, do we necessarily say that that institution does not exist, or it should be done away with? It is not the name. This university has been here for 150 years? 149. It has represented various governments during that period. And its culture and ethics have gone through those transitions. Today, I'm not so sure if 50 years ago, you would have this kind of discussion in this institution. Let me not go that far. We had a radical, I'm not sure if it was economic transformation. In 1990s, Professor Kote was reminding me that the last time we met, it was in another hall here. I came to address a meeting. I'm not sure if it was a union, but we were talking about civil society and the civics. I think in that meeting, the students didn't quite agree with what I was saying. And I was downstairs, and they were upstairs. And one of them smartly took a bucket of water and threw it on me from the bottom. But that's democracy. They had the freedom to express themselves. Now, therefore, I don't have an answer. I like the idea that can we not reconceptualize the state itself and stop using the terminology of a state as was traditionally used? I'm not sure what the replacement of that is. Because, first of all, we must agree, in a state you have to have people who make laws. That's the legislature. You have to have people who govern, which is the executive. You have to have the judiciary, which is the institution that decides whether there is a wrong or a right. It interprets those legislation that we have passed. But all of this happens within a sovereign state, a territory that has defined boundaries with certain sovereign powers. The reality is that there is no state that is absolutely sovereign. Because you have international agencies and organizations like the UN, like World Health Organization, like security agencies across the world. That's why somebody was saying South Africa is getting into what? Gray, is going to be gray listed. The gray listing means that South Africa can't stand alone and say, this is how I'm going to do things. Whatever it does is impacted upon or impacts on other institutions that deal with security matters. So there's no such a thing as South Africa as an isolated sovereign entity. It is sovereign to a certain degree. Just like as we are independent individuals within a democratic state, we've got powers, we've got freedom to say things. But Kaya here was talking about the media. See, the media always says we've got freedom of expression and freedom of this and freedom of that. But whatever they say as individuals impacts on the way society is run, and it definitely can affect people's lives beyond the individuals that are expressing certain views. And therefore, that's why I was saying, I'm not an expert in all of the questions that you are raising, because you are raising the question of how do you constitute a state? A state is a very complex entity. We have these 3-4 elements, but it's much more broader and more complex than that. Thank you.
Thank you. The slap in the wrist, what then? The section that I was referring to comes from the Criminal Procedure Act. It is a 1977 act. And in 2006, Chief Justice Langa, in the case of S versus Kutsia, where this particular section was actually being challenged, he specifically directed the legislature to make changes to the law. And he said that we are sitting with legislation which is outdated, yet we are now having a constitution which can guide us in the way in which we can make amendments to those particular old legislations. Unfortunately, that wasn't done. And yes, indeed, a fine for a corporation is the same as when somebody who is very rich parks illegally, and then they are given this hefty fine. What you and me may think is hefty is not hefty for them. So tomorrow what's gonna happen? They're just gonna do it again. The same applies with these corporations. So in practice, this slap in the face, in the face or in the wrist, whatever, it results in those corporations actually becoming repeat offenders. And what they actually do is they even have a budget and they put aside money to say this one is for when we commit crimes. So unfortunately, our legislature has totally ignored the late Chief Justice Langa. And there is academic writing, mine included, which has been ignored, specifically saying something needs to be done here. And what has happened in countries like the UK, in Canada as well, is they also experienced such problems. There was an outcry, nothing was happening until something major happened, and then there was this huge public outcry, which then forced the legislature to do something. I'm not sure if maybe that is what we are waiting for. Is our legislature waiting for a huge disaster to happen, and then only then it will say, oh, this legislation, which is far more than 30 years old, it is now time for us to do something about it. So, way forward, what then? I'm not sure, but when that time comes, I hope you will be with me, because I will be part of those who are leading that public outcry. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we agree that we'll finish at 1 o'clock. So may I take the last round, because we still have got 2 items. Prof. Gobo, kindly be ready for the way forward. Yes, I will. And then it will be Prof. Villinkom. No, we're opening the floor. We are opening the floor. Yes. Okay, I've got ladies. Yes, okay. We're opening the floor, Prof. You also want to raise your hand? Okay, I've got a hand, and then I've got a hand, and then 3, 4, 5, 6 at the back. Can I take 6? Yes. Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. My name is Nomonde Mnukwa.
Is the TV still around, because they want you to stand to show? Yeah,
Thank
the
you.
TV. Please stand up. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
For good profile.
Thank you. My name is Nomonde Mnukwa. I work for the department called Government Communication and Information Systems. I have 4 questions, but I will just be so succinct on all of them. To Professor Puleng, I would like to know that are there any plans for UNISA as an institution to have courses? There might be long-term, short-term, whatever it may be, or some plans to partner with government in empowering and capacitating individuals, managers, and employees on information and strategies to prevent or mitigate the state capture occurrences that we have witnessed in our country. The second one is to Professor Botha, to understand if there is any existing studies on how community structures, i.e. for example, your families, your faith-based organizations and schools, that can that can assist us in terms of inculcating a culture of good values as a variable to mitigate corruption and unethical behavior, which I believe is the initial point that leads to state capture.
Okay, thank you very much. 2, I think, would be fair. Okay. Then the guy, yes, the mic, yeah. It will be unfair if you ask all 4. The mic, please, to the guy. Okay, you can use your...
Thank you very much.
Someone is having the mic on. It's supposed to be red. All right. Continue.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Program Director. Thank you very much for the presentation from the speakers. When I came here, I thought that Mr. T. Botha was an Afrikaner. I wanted to speak in Afrikaans and say, "Goeiemorgen, alle mensen." But I was shocked when I was here, so I'm learning something new. My name is Dr. George Tsibani. I'm an independent consultant, also a research associate at UJ. I'm missing 2 issues. One, how is the issue around the sunset clause during the CODESA facilitated through the Government of National Unity, created a conducive environment for state capture? I'm missing that debate. And also I'm missing a conceptualization around the difference between looting of state resources versus the state capture. And I think there's a difference between the 2. I'm missing that debate as well.
Who needs to respond to that?
Yeah, and I'm also missing, Chair, the issue around the fact that there was a mention that there was something called state shelter that started in Asian countries.
But as far as I'm concerned, from a developmental state perspective, I do feel like the Asian tigers have managed to overcome a number of similar conditions that we have now in South Africa and Africa. And what is it that we can learn from the Asian tigers in terms of overcoming crime, looting of state, and governance that is now, in my view, more global in terms of development?
Your question is directed to?
It's Professor Kotze.
Professor Kotze.
Yes.
Okay. Prof. Masenya, your question?
Thank you very much first to Dr. Buerta for your very insightful, informative, intriguing lecture. Thank you very much. And to all the discussants, I wish we had more time. And I start therefore with, I'm curious, I'm sorry that you couldn't come to the end, Dr. Lukubu, about the institutional capture, the MTT report. I'm just curious about a short description of your conclusion, because it really hits home right here at home. And then to all of you, it could be you or all the, it seems it's gendered, this so-called thing called state capture. Seems it's a capture of the state by men. Is it gendered? The Guptas were men and Zuma men. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. Was it Mr. Mabusela, then Prof. Modisane, in that order?
Thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Rodney Mabusela from College of Women Sciences, a former student leader in this university. My question is directed to Mr. Kanyasi Tol as a political analyst, as this is a political question. My understanding of state capture is that state capture cannot exist in the absence of political capture. Meaning that political capture enables state capture. In our case of South Africa, we have seen it happening in a way where the governing party established what we call a cadre deployment committee, in line with the cadre deployment policy, to facilitate the appointment and influence the appointment of senior officials in various state institutions. You are ESCOM, you are Transnet, DINEL, and SABC, amongst others. So it is not a thing of Jacob Zuma, according to my understanding. It is a thing of the ruling party. That's why it established what is called a cadre deployment committee. It's just that it happened too much under the President Zuma. So my question to you, Kanya, is that what should be done to ensure that the principle of clear division between the ruling party and the state, it is realized in ensuring public accountability? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Prof. Modisane?
Thank you, Chair. My name is Cameron Modisane, and I'm from the College of Accounting Sciences. My question is also for Mr. Sitole. The question is as follows. Do you think state capture would have happened without the aiding and abetting by professionals, which included chartered accountants, lawyers, engineers, and supply chain managers, etc.? And the second part would be, what do you think was their role, these professionals? And also, what can be done in future just to make sure that it is actually prevented that professionals are actually entangled in politics and also in the looting of state resources? Thank you.
Prof. Modisane, who needs to respond to your question?
Oh, Kaya Sitole.
Kaya Sitole again. All right. Colleagues, am I missing anyone? All right.
What do you say?
Okay. 1, 2, then we close, yeah.
My name is Ihloho Nolwenweto. I'm from the Department of Financial Governance. So I think at the heart of this is capturing resources for personal use or for business use, private use. And it seems at the heart of this, it's all about economic power. And those that are generally captured are not really economically free or don't have as much as economic power as they'd like. So I'd like to know how, because it's not just South Africa that's captured. A lot of countries are captured, including the most high at the top. So how do we resolve this, at least for the betterment of our people, particularly what was said by the independent consultant there? How do we resolve it to help our nations? I'll direct the questions to Kaya Sotole and Prof. Dirk.
Okay. Yes, and then,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yes, you may go.
Yeah, thank you very much. My question will be directed to our keynote speaker, Dr. Botha. Yes. I'm just concerned because, you know, this state capture, most of the people who are involved are top management. And we used to have SSA, State Security Agency, who actually played a vital role in doing security vetting. And these people who have been issued with top security clearance certificate. Then my question is, what this kind of certificate, what is now the role of this certificate? Because, you know, remember, you will also agree with me to say where there is money, there is a risk involved. Thank you.
Okay. It was for Kaya too. Or for the keynote. Okay, colleagues, yes, the last one. Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lev Solwadi from the Department of Public Enterprises.
Please stand for the TV, please.
Right, my question is directed to Professor Tina Ace. It relates to the protection of whistleblowers. And in her speech, she mentioned that a lot of them suffer occupational reprisals. And the question that one wonders about is, how is this rampant occupational reprisal being experienced by employees when we have organized labor in place? So could there be a prominent role that organized labor plays more meaningfully going forward that reforms, you know, the protection of whistleblowers? Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Prof. Lenkabula, may you start, and then we go this way. There was a question from the lady on the causes. Yeah, we'll use the mic. Then we go this way, and then Dr. Botha will be the last one. And then we wrap up, then Prof. Kobo, then will be the next, then
Yeah.
Prof.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I want to state that the University of South Africa, as a national asset, but also a continental asset, is committed to ensuring that national questions, continental questions, but the edification of democracy becomes a priority in our engagements, in our scholarly work in terms of research, engaged scholarship, teaching, including in creating opportunities of analysis engagements like this. And therefore, this is not the start of the deliberative processes around these matters, but you'd realize that colleagues who have already presented are writing on reflections on how to ensure that state institutions, private sector, as well as the public sector institutions themselves work towards the public good. The second aspect, therefore, is that the colleges of law, accounting, sciences, humanities, CSET, even our science and engineering colleges, KAIS and others, are committed to ensuring that the lessons from the Zondo Commission, this is the first in the world where you have a concerted effort by the state to analyze the anomalies within the states, the ethics, the accounting system, including the hegemonic issues around how we organize ourselves. We want to be the university that hosts those resources, but in order that we can strengthen our democratic systems. Therefore, I want to say we will always be available for the public sector, private sector, as well as society to partner in ensuring that knowledge areas and interventions around these matters are articulated. There was a reference to the MTT report of the Ministerial Task Team on UNISA to evaluate matters around 2020 and before around the university, its mission drift, whether the governance systems of the university and the statutory committees of the university would have governed the processes of the university accordingly. This is a matter that a colleague has raised. Sorry, had raised as an area of trying to see the nexus between the state and institutional captures and wanting us to deliberate on. As the Principal and Vice Chancellor, I want to reaffirm the fact that that was a process that has been shared with the university and the council, and the responses have been given to the state around the MTT report. The process that the university is currently underway is the process that is legitimated, that is gazetted in the laws of the land, in which an assessor has been appointed to then follow through on the outcomes and the statements or the decisions or propositions that are entailed in the ministerial task team report. So the processes are underway. We are open to being investigated, evaluated as a university in order that the governance systems, but also the asset of society functions. So this is all I can say, but I thought I should respond to those two matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think you fit it right on the nail. I think what is important now, it's naturally South Africans seek restoration, seek redress and accountability. And I think with the assessor that is busy now, looking at these matters, as Prof has just alluded, let's give space to that. And once the report is ready, and I think we need to deal with these matters without fear or favor. And this is how we are going to restore this university, get it to where it used to be, and be the university of the land. Thanks. I want to pause there. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, I hope I understood your question correctly. I think what is important with regard to whistleblowing is that we've got to create an environment where anybody who's a member or a former member of an organization who comes across information that seems problematic within the organization has the freedom to raise those concerns and will be protected when they raise those concerns. The whole thing, what generally happens with whistleblowers, so anybody could potentially be a whistleblower. When you come across information, you come across something that looks wrong, that you then raise those concerns to somebody who can do something about it. And that's basically the definition of a whistleblower. And that we implement systems within our institutions, within our government departments, that makes it possible for people to go and raise those concerns without fearing the retaliation that's going to come. Now, a lot of organizations, my own university included, has these so-called hotlines. But generally, the whistleblowers that I've spoken to in my research and that I've interviewed, I generally ask them. I remember once I was interviewing a whistleblower at a university. I won't mention which one. Wasn't this one? It was a different one. And she worked elsewhere. She didn't blow the whistle on the university. She worked elsewhere. But she's now employed at this university after a big struggle to find a different job. And when we ended with the interview, I saw the pamphlet there, and I said, if you come across something going wrong here, will you phone that hotline? And she said, never. And I said, why not? And she said, because I do not trust what people are going to do with that information, because it's so anonymous, right? And people don't know who that information goes to. And often with these hotlines, often with organizations, they implement the hotlines, also because the Protected Disclosures Act says, you know, if there are stronger requirements if people haven't followed the internal processes first before going outside of the organization. So they implement those hotlines, but they don't actually do anything about it. Or even if people are anonymous, they try and find out who is the whistleblower, you know, to try and attack the whistleblower. So often what happens when people disclose information, when they blow the whistle, the focus tends to be on the messenger rather than on the message. So you would have all sorts of debates about whether that person had the right motives, were it purely altruistic, were this the most ethical person that you can find. And if they weren't, then we don't call them a whistleblower anymore, or we don't listen to what they say. My argument is what it should be of concern to all of us is the message that they're bringing across. Does that message show the possibility of wrongdoing occurring in the organization? And then it should be investigated and it should be addressed without penalizing that particular person or retaliating against that particular person. Of course, it becomes much more complex when that person, that whistleblower, was him or herself involved in the wrongdoing and then decided that I'm now going to, you know, blow the whistle. After that, it becomes a little bit more tricky, but the focus should be on the message rather than on the messenger. And that's the only way in which people will be confident when they come across wrongdoing to try and do something about, rather than just turning their heads away.
I have a few questions. The first one is about the difference between state looting or looting of state resources and state capture. Looting of state resources seems to me to be a more or less comprehensive than state capturing. State capturing has included, but state looting is about budgets, about theft, about fraud, about taking away what belongs in a more sort of a physical sense, the assets of the state. State capture is about, it's much more than that. It's about the political component of it. It's about the state institutions trying to get control over some of the state institutions, using state institutions against others, like, for example, the intelligence or the criminal intelligence or national prosecuting authority, in order to eliminate or to downplay your opponents, or to embarrass them in some cases, or to be able to get control over state institutions so that the appointment process, persons are appointed who are supportive of you, who are as opposed to others. So the idea of factionalism, for instance, which is part of our political lexicon, is in a sense connected to that idea. So state capture is just, in summary, much more expansive than state looting. It includes state looting, but more than that. The Asian tigers, or the developmental state, it started with Japan in the late 40s and early 50s. Thereafter, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, and similar countries. What can we learn from them? The first thing is that it depends on state capacity. All these developmental states, the one feature that they shared is that they have very strong state capacity, public sector public institutions, and that they could do the work that they have to do on behalf of the state or in the name of the state. They could provide services, they could provide infrastructure, they could provide also an environment for the economy to grow. The second important, very, very important component of the developmental state is that there's a very close partnership between the private sector and the public sector. And I think this is why President Ramaphosa talks so much about social compacts or social partnerships or the private-public partnerships. That's very typical of a developmental state. The downside of developmental states, they were all undemocratic. All undemocratic, one-party states. They later democratized South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, and so on. But when they had their high growth rates, they were undemocratic. No trade unions allowed across the board. That's why they had high growth rates. It's because of low production costs, high centralized planning, those type of things. So there's up to now, can anyone mention a democratic developmental state? Brazil, Botswana? We don't know. That's the conceptual problem of the developmental state. The other question I'm not exactly sure how to answer, and I think we shared it. It's about the fact that it affects economic problems and it sort of deals with economic problems. But at the same time, I think that the one point that we have to be clear about is that state capture is to the benefit of those who already have a lot. It's not the poor people. It's people in positions of power. It's people in and companies, whether it's South African, if we talk about state capture in South Africa, South African companies, auditing companies, banks, big ones, it's not the small companies, and the international companies, Bell Pottinger, McKinsey, all of those others. So in that sense, it is at the same time, therefore, those who are already in a position of being powerful. To be involved in state capture, you have to be powerful. It's not a process or so in which those who are not yet powerful can play a role. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but this is one of the components or perspectives that I think we need to understand. Thank you.
All right, I had a couple of very, very, very difficult questions. I don't know if, VC, if I have the option to opt out of answering, plead the Fifth Amendment. So the last one I want to start with is the one from Nitlohonolo. And the question was whether the lack of economic autonomy facilitate the capture of individuals. And the answer is overwhelmingly yes. So in South Africa in particular, we have a problem where public officials don't really have a lot of options beyond public office, and that makes it very easy for people to essentially grease their palms in order to get them to do things in a particular way. So in the South African context, I'm going to use 3 examples. The first one is obviously Vincent Smith, who used to run one of the most important parliamentary committees, and as it turned out, it was easy for him to run it because Bosasa was taking care of all his expenses. And of course, for a lot of people, that sort of opened up that can of worms where we could then see that even those that look like they are worth trusting, I mean, he's a type of guy that a lot of people had faith in because he used to run the affairs of that committee quite well, at least in the public arena. But he was getting millions behind the scenes on the basis that he wasn't going to hold the people that were facilitating the theft of public resources through Bosasa accountable. So that's the first option. The second one, quite interestingly, emerged a couple of weeks ago when Mondli Gungubele, against his better judgment, assuming he has some judgment, decided to then defend the whole issue around public ministers getting free water and electricity. And one of his defenses was that, well, remember, our jobs are not similar to the type of job that everyone else has. We do not have job security, so it may look like we're earning a lot of money, but we're not guaranteed that we're going to earn that salary in the long run. And he was literally confessing to the question that you've just raised, in that in the absence of financial and economic autonomy, it makes it very easy for me to walk up to him to say, you know that the next reshuffle is coming, and you're not going to keep that job. However, if you sign that contract before you lose your job as a minister, I'll take care of you beyond that reshuffle. So that's essentially what the problem that we have in relation to the lack of economic autonomy that our ministers have. But what's quite important is that South Africa has always been awake to this problem. And we've dealt with it in one part of the state, and that's in the center of the judiciary. So the reason we pay our judges beyond the term of office is that you do not want this possibility that in the last 12 to 18 months of a person's tenure in the judiciary, they suddenly start judging or issuing judgments that favor the Bedford View Mafia, for example, on the basis that, well, after I retire next month, you guys will remember that I'm the one that got you off the hook. So that's how we actually pay judges for a lifetime in order to avoid that possibility of them essentially selling judgments in order to secure their economic windfalls beyond the term of office. It hasn't worked as perfect as we'd like, and those of you in Pretoria will know very well. We currently have a magistrate, and I'm going to say he's from Pretoria because he's based in Pretoria, and that is the magistrate Naya, who is actually one guy for whom that model seemed to not work. So he took bribes from Bosasa in particular in order to rule, or to get them off the hook, because Bosasa never ever gets indicted for anything. So the model is there. It hasn't worked perfectly because we saw with him that in spite of the fact that there was a possibility that had he stayed in the judiciary long enough, had he been elevated, he could have got that lifetime salary. But remember, the magistrates earn much less than the judges that we know. So whether there was an incentive that then said to him, take the money from Bosasa and get them off the hook, we don't know. But you are very correct in that. That lack of economic security is a big red flag, in that people in positions of authority can be bought. We know that for sure. So that's the first part. The second one was relating to whether professionals and professional institutions were the drivers of state capture. They were not. What they did was that they legitimized it. So the most important thing that happened during the state capture years is that people like myself made it very easy to sell corruption on the basis that if somebody comes and says, look, here's a particular report and it's been signed off by KPMG, mainly because they tended to sign them off, so I'm happy to use them. Once they said it's been signed off by KPMG, KPMG is not Kaya Sithole Incorporated. It's a multinational brand whose prestige and reputation essentially sells its ideas more than the substance of its ideas. So that's why it was easy for institutions like SARS to go to Bain and say, you will do this. Because the moment Bain says that this is the answer, if I go on SABC and I say that I disagree, everyone will say that you're talking nonsense. In fact, it happened a couple of months ago where in the Road Accident Fund, they took a decision to apply the wrong accounting policy. And I said they were talking nonsense, their policy was wrong. But their response, which even made its way to the court paper as well, PwC said that we're right. So there's some random guy wearing something on the head telling you that you're wrong, and PwC says you're right. So therefore, PwC must win. And they got to court, and they were told that PwC was talking nonsense. So generally, very few people would ever take my word against the word of a blue chip multinational. So what those entities did, whether you look at McKinsey with the Transnet deals or even at Eskom deal, is that the moment that particular letterhead that says that this is an institution whose prestige and whose reputation is second to none, it simply makes it very easy for me to then push through deals because McKinsey said so who are you to say otherwise? So for a lot of people, they were sidelined, particularly in the Eskom conversations, on the basis that they were told that this has been signed off by the most prestigious international consulting firm that you can find. So these organizations, they literally lent a sense of legitimacy to state capture that would have otherwise not existed if they hadn't sold themselves off. And they're still doing it, as you've just heard, with the case of PwC and the Road Accident Fund. The last question was on whether state capture is only enabled by political capture. Well, the answer is very simple. Public resources are what belongs to us. What we then do is that we elect people to be the custodians of those public resources. And that's what, politicians who are elected into office are supposed to do. They are supposed to be the custodians of public resources. So naturally, no one can just walk into an institution like UNISA, which is a national asset, and say, oh, I'm taking over the Senate Hall, I'm now the owner. That person would have to get into a conversation with whoever are the custodians of the institution, whether it's management or whether it's the council, and then say, I would like to do X, Y, Z. So similarly here, that interaction between public resources, the custodians thereof, and the thieves that want access to public resources requires them to get this system in the middle, these custodians who are supposed to be the barbarians at our proverbial gate, to be the ones that concede and say, well, actually, you can steal that one particular muffin from the UNISA kitchen, and then that's how it all starts. So it's not a uniquely South African problem, it's everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world is that as soon as you can get those custodians to actually bend to your will, it makes it very easy for you to access public resources in one form or another. How do we get around that? Well, you raised a very important question at the very end, which was to say that, and this is a view that a lot of people share, that if you had a much clearer distinction between the party and the state, then you wouldn't have these problems. And I always give people a very, very difficult answer to say, well, in China, for example, there is by law absolutely no distinction between the party and the state, and people do not randomly steal, because whoever are the custodians of the system know what their duty is, and they know what the consequences are. In South Africa, consequences are not a thing. The only reason you get held accountable in South Africa is if you've been stupid enough to get caught. That is the problem.
I'm just going to take this opportunity to round off that question that I had. I won't be long. Just to say that in other countries, they do use the fine, but in addition to that, they do have other sanctions. For instance, we need to be creative. Publicity orders, whereby repeatedly something is being published in the media which exposes this particular corporation to say that this is what they have done in the past. In that way, people who come into the area who do not know about it, then they are kind of deterred from dealing with that particular corporation. And then you also have community service, but community service, you have to be careful about it, because if you have community service but you don't have a publicity order, then you may find yourself in a situation where you're actually promoting the company, because if, say, for instance, that community service is that they need to feed the people who are on the street maybe every Friday. If I'm new in the community and I see that happening, then do you see that it's going to have a reverse effect? Because I now would like to deal with that particular company because of the good thing that they're doing in the community, because I don't have the information that they are actually doing this out of shame. They are doing this as an order from court because of what they have done previously. So there are other sanctions that can be used. And with the fine, what I can say with our South African judiciary is that not always do they actually look at the worth of the corporation when fining that corporation, and that's what lets us down. Because if I'm fining a corporation which is worth a lot of money, but I'm just giving a small fine, then I'm basically giving them a license to go and become repeat offenders. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, MC Hez. There was a question that I'm curious to respond to, the question of the separation between the state and the political parties. You know, during the National Party government, all state institutions were, sorry, I'm using a gender-insensitive thing, were manned by people appointed by the Broederbond. And at Fort de Wet in 1975-6, he was appointed he was a member of the Broederbond. Secondly, in the post-apartheid era, ANC comes into power, and it appoints a deployment committee. And the deployment committee can only be appointed, or can only be people who are loyal to the party. They may or may not have the necessary skills, but they've got to serve a particular purpose. In the same way as the Broederbond did during the apartheid era. They appointed people in those positions because they believed and they served that particular ideology. Now comes to the state separation. If the party runs the state for 10, 15, 20 years and has manned the institutions with its deployees, the separation between the state and the party becomes very thin. Because essentially, that state is run by that party, and those institutions reflect the culture of that political party that is in power. So it becomes less and less, rather the separation between the two becomes blurred. I know you may not agree with me, or the reality is that that is a fact. You know, I was a DG of a province. The premier was removed, and we were sitting at a cabinet meeting of the province. The premier is called to a phone next door to his office. He comes back within 5-10 minutes. He says, I've been told to leave office. He tells us I was the secretary of that cabinet. Everybody, all the MECs were crying and what have you. Now, that message, obviously because he's a politician, came from the political party. Now, I am therefore inherited by the new premier. And the new premier says to me, I don't want so-and-so in that position. Take him from there to there. I'm telling you a fact, not a fiction. And then I say, Premier, this person, because we've just done the organogram, there is no post in that department where you say I must transfer him to. He's going to be additional to the establishment, therefore redundant. He says, okay. I advertise posts of heads of departments. And I had adopted an approach that says, I don't sit in the interviewing panels. I want 3 shortlisted people to be brought to me by the people who are sitting in the panel. Then we can discuss issues of regional representation, race, gender. If number 3 is good and is a woman or comes from a particular region, and in that department there's not enough representation of women, I would say no. Yes, so-and-so might have been good, but we must take into account representation, but take into account qualifications as well. So the posts go out, the adverts, we shortlist and they appoint, recommended to me. And on the day that I'm signing the appointments, I get a call. Just before I send the letters. But of course, I had instructed the secretary to post them anyway. But I get a call. Can you please meet us at 5 o'clock? Oh, who's us? It's the delegation of the cabinet, kitchen cabinet. So I said, okay, fine, I come. And I'm instructed, now I'm talking about, I'm a DG, by the party operatives please withdraw these appointments. Fortunately for me, I have already sent them out. And I say to them, guys, I had advertised these posts, and you were there. If you had people who were interested and you wanted to lobby for them, you should have applied. Then you have a chance to lobby. Because then you lobby in a formal way and in a professional way. The fact that I have already appointed these people and they reacted to an advert, I have no reason to withdraw or not to appoint them. And therefore, I can't listen to you. They say, oh, yeah, okay. Now that's the second warning. The first one was remove this person to that one. This one is, now I'm telling them that I'm not going to withdraw. That's a big problem. Then I had regular meetings with the Premier once a week. And normally I would I would have a few points of discussion in the meeting. So I come and I sit there. The Premier says, he calls me by my clan name, Mpinga. And that's my clan name. Can you put aside your agenda? I've got something to discuss with you. And then he says to me, you know very well that I used to play rugby. I say, yes, Premier. He says, you know, my position in rugby was this. I say, yes, Premier. It was my responsibility to ensure that the ball comes out of the pack. I say, yes, Premier. Yes, Premier. And I pass it from the scrum, make sure to the scrum half, to the fly half, first center, second center, to the scoring line. I say, yes, Premier. He says, what I've discovered with you is that each time I pass the ball to you, you fall with it and die. So we're not scoring. I said, yes, Premier. You also know that I play, and we happen to know each other very well. I said, you also know, Premier, that I played. And I did play rugby, first team, both Newell and second Kwazakele. I also played number 8. I ensured that the ball comes out and it goes to the back line. Whether we won the match or we lost it, we do a review of that match after the match. And the person who would do that review would be the coach and the captain, and tell us where we lost or how we lost and how we won. I'm finishing. And it is the role of the coach or the team manager to review, and if so-and-so caused us to lose, you may suspend him, this one, and make him go and correct his mistakes and so forth. And in that regard, you are the key person. Make sure that you do what you are supposed to do. And that was the end of the game. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Botha, with your wisdom. Thank you very much, colleagues. May you give them the round of applause? Yeah. Colleagues, I'm just begging for 10 minutes. 10 minutes. It's going to be Prof. Gobo, then Prof. Vilinkomo, then we'll be invited upstairs for lunch, third floor. Just 10 minutes, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. Ngosi, Vice Chancellor and Principal, Prof. Buleng, Lingabula, Dr. Botha, colleagues, greetings, and thank you so much for the opportunity to just reflect and to imagine the way forward from the powerful lecture presented today. I must express my appreciation for this lecture and responses that attempt to debunk the myth of or perception that problems in the governance and state capture originate from the black-led government, while on the contrary, the apartheid government had its share. The lecture further debunks a perception that exonerates the empire, which is defined by Alan Busak and others as a coming together of economic, cultural, political, and military power in our world today, constituted by a reality and a spirit of lordless domination created by humankind, an all-encompassing global reality serving, protecting, and defending the interests of powerful corporations, nations, elites, and privileged people, while exploiting creation, imperiously excludes, enslaves, and even sacrifices humanity. And the lecture debunks a misconception that further exonerates the globalizing world, as stated in the Accra Confession that I've read, where they state that we see the dramatic convergence of the economic crisis with the integration of economic globalization and geopolitics backed by neoliberal ideology. This is a global system that defends and protects the interests of the powerful. It affects and captivates us all. Now, the global system that captivates us all and protects the interests of the rich is at play, even the black-led government in a democratic country. A democratic country that has adopted a democratic liberal ideology that has been critiqued by the likes of Ramose, Mamdani, Velem, and others as a product of modernity itself. In a democratic country, the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. And this is increased with a toxic symbiosis of the global order of economics and the practices that we experience in our democratic country today at the hands of our fellow blacks. The fusion of spheres and the collapse of the tension that differentiate them while bonded together, defended militaristically, creates a spirit of lordless domination, pervasive and destructive to life, as it also colonizes consciousness. The unprecedented cultural consciousness after decades of black cultural suppression in the South African public life since the 1990s summons us to the need to harness African political symbols in public life. Now, in thinking about a way forward, one is conscious of the critique of ideologies that are abstract as academic responses from the ivory towers. Perhaps a caution to us to think about a balanced approach, where the pertinent question rather becomes, from the issues that we have identified, what practical things can we also think of to remedy these issues, attempts to intentionally move towards solving the problems. The question of interlocution also becomes important as we think about the stakeholders that we can work with, the caution perhaps on the silencing of certain voices of those
in the margins, in the following that have come out. The dialogues that we envisage, whether in forms of research projects that critique and enhance consciousness in systems of governance, economic systems, knowledge systems, where we look at teaching and learning, engaged scholarship, as touched on by our VC, political systems, and others in the quest for liberation and the state that is ethical, and perhaps to reaffirm the words of the VC, not yet uhuru, aluta continua. Thank you.
I should have taken the shortcut. Mine is quite an easy job. I want us to start off by clapping our hands, because I can tell you the lecture or the seminar was high caliber. The panel was extraordinary, outstanding. The questions were also highly educational and very important. Let's give all the players a big hand. Professor Linkabola, I'm going to start off with you. I thank you very much for promoting scholarship and wanting to see this university become a magnet of excellence, not only in South Africa, but also continentally and in the world. Thank you very much. You have done a fantastic job. The keynote speaker, Dr. Tozamile Buota, we go a long way, but we're not going to go into that. Maybe we're party to all of some of these problems which were discussed today. Maybe, I'm not saying we are. You invoked concepts like glasnost and perestroika, which rang a bell. That was our era of analysis. Thank you very much for the eloquent presentation you gave, and you have given an opportunity for young scholars, students, to want to explore this interesting history. And then to Professor Mboya, well done in presenting our keynote speaker. Where are you? Oh, okay, there you are. Thank you very much for actually doing a good job in presenting our eloquent speaker. You are also outstanding yourself. I think we miss you at the University of South Africa. Professor Linkabola, we have to find a way to actually bring back institutional memory to assess this institution to be number one in the country and number one in the world. Thank you very much. I want to also thank the panelists. As I said, you evoked very interesting perspectives. There was the legal perspective, the political economy analysis perspective, the media role perspective, whistleblower, the understanding of nepotism, nannyism, and cronyism. Outstanding. You did a fantastic job. And finally, not finally, I want to also thank the diplomats who are here, even though you didn't ask any questions. I saw the ambassador from Namibia, I saw the High Commissioner from Singapore, and I'm sure there are others in this room. We are very happy to have you here, and we thank you for caring about this fantastic University of South Africa, which is turning 150 years next year. And I want to thank the students. Students are here to engage, and students are here to ask questions, and students should be encouraged to be part and parcel of the knowledge generation and wanting to create a better future for all of us. I want to thank the academics and staff who are here. Your role is very significant because you've got to share your knowledge with the students, you've got to share with those who are hungry for knowledge. So please keep on coming to these important seminars. The organizers, outstanding. This has been very well organized. I want to thank also the chairperson, Madam Nkosi, Professor Nkosi, in other words. You chaired this occasion, the panel, very well, and I want to thank also our other colleague for an outstanding chairing of the whole occasion. When you took off, you took us took us in the right direction. And finally, you know, the media is very important. The media doesn't project you if you don't tell your story. You got to tell your story. So we thank the media for being here, and we want to encourage the media to concentrate on the positive aspects of what an institution like the University of South Africa is pursuing and achieving. Very well done, media, for being here. And I cannot but not help it quote Nelson Mandela. Tozie and I will know where we come from with him. You know, Nelson Mandela said to us in 1994, I quote, "If the public service collapses or gets corrupted, the whole state machinery is gone. There'll be nothing left of it," close quote. Yeah, long live Nelson Mandela, and thank you very much. Food is the last thing I think about, but lunch is going to be served on the 3rd floor. There'll be ushers to guide you. So you're all welcome to the lunch. Thank you.